Vivian Hale was 36 hours into a double shift when the black SUVs pulled up outside the ER entrance and a man in a wheelchair looked at her like she was the last real thing left in the world. She should have walked away. She needed the money. She took the deal. 1 year. No love, no questions. Just survival. Until survival stopped feeling like enough. If you've ever stayed somewhere longer than you planned because leaving felt like cutting off your own arm, drop your city in the comments and hit like. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Vivian Hale almost quit nursing started the same way most bad nights did. With blood she couldn't stop and a family screaming in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3. The man on her table was 22 years old, maybe 23, with 2 gunshot wounds to the abdomen and the pale, sweating stillness of someone whose body had already begun making quiet arrangements without telling his brain. His name, according to the paramedic report, was Darius. No last name offered, no ID recovered at the scene. He'd been found 2 blocks from the Milburn housing projects on the south side, face down on wet asphalt, and the responding officers hadn't exactly rushed the call. Vivian didn't think about any of that. She thought about the bleed. "Pressure's dropping," said Kenji, the second-year resident working beside her, his voice carrying that particular tightness of someone trying very hard not to sound afraid. 70/40 and falling. "I see it." Vivian's gloved hands moved without hesitation, packing gauze into the lower wound with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this so many times the motions lived in her muscles rather than her mind. "Get me 2 large-bore IVs and tell surgery we need the OR in the next 4 minutes, or this kid goes on my conscience for the rest of the month." They're backed up. Appendix case. "Tell them to move faster." She looked up briefly. "Kenji, tell them to move faster." He went. The fluorescent lights above Trauma Bay 3 hummed their indifferent hum. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarm went off and then stopped. The woman in the hallway, Darius's mother, Vivian assumed, though nobody had confirmed it, had stopped screaming and started the worst thing, the quieter thing, the low rhythmic keening that Vivian had learned after 4 years in this ER, meant a person had begun to understand what was actually happening. Vivian focused on the bleed. She had been on her feet for 36 consecutive hours. Not because her schedule demanded it. Her shift had technically ended at 7 that morning. But because the nurse who was supposed to relieve her had called in sick, and the one after that had been stuck in traffic on the I-90, and somewhere around hour 20, Vivian had stopped checking her phone for updates and simply accepted that this was what her life was now. This bay, this table, this particular shade of overhead light that made everyone look slightly dead before they actually were. Her feet had gone past hurting into a kind of numb conversation with the floor. Her back carried a persistent, low-grade ache that she'd learned to tune out the way you tune out the sound of your own refrigerator. She'd eaten half a granola bar at noon and nothing since. She was 31 years old and she felt 60. Darius made it to surgery with 90 seconds to spare. Vivian stripped her gloves at the sink, watching the water run pink and then clear, and allowed herself exactly 1 moment of the shaking that she usually suppressed until she was alone. Her hands trembled slightly under the stream. She pressed them flat against the basin until they stopped. Then she went back out. Marwasha. The ER at Chicago Memorial was not a glamorous place. The waiting room chairs were the color of old mustard and smelled of industrial cleaner and human exhaustion. The vending machine near the entrance had been broken for 3 weeks in a way that still dispensed things but charged you twice. The staff bathroom on the second floor had a motion sensor light that required you to wave your arm every 4 minutes or plunge yourself into darkness, which Vivian had stopped finding funny around the 6-month mark and had simply integrated into her bathroom behavior as a fact of existence. None of this was what she'd imagined when she was 19, filling out her nursing school application at the kitchen table of the apartment where she and her younger brother Marcus had been living since their mother's stroke, and subsequent death left them technically alone in the world, practically speaking, their father having accomplished his own disappearance 3 years prior in a manner that involved another woman and a Greyhound bus to Indianapolis. She had imagined something cleaner, something where the skill was visible, where you could point to a moment and say, "There, I did that. That person is alive because I was standing in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge." And those moments existed. She wasn't cynical enough to pretend they didn't. But they arrived wrapped in so much noise and shortage and paperwork and the particular institutional weight of a hospital system that had been underfunded for so long, it had developed a kind of philosophical acceptance of its own dysfunction that those moments sometimes felt like finding a $20 bill in a coat pocket. Real, but small against the rest of it. It was 11:47 when her shift officially, genuinely ended. She changed in the locker room. Jeans, her brother Marcus's old Northwestern sweatshirt that she'd stolen years ago, and that now functioned as her primary off-duty garment, boots that needed replacing, and walked out into a February night that hit her face like an open hand. Chicago in February was not a metaphor. It was a physical argument. The wind off the lake had opinions, and it shared them without mercy, driving through coat fabric and the spaces between collar and scarf with the focused intensity of something that wanted to reach your bones specifically. Vivian pulled her hood up and walked the half block to the bus stop with her head down. The kind of walking that wasn't really movement so much as controlled leaning into the direction you needed to go. The stop was empty except for a man in a puffy jacket who appeared to be asleep sitting up, which Vivian had seen enough times in this city to register as neither alarming nor remarkable. She checked her phone while she waited. 3 texts from Marcus, the last one sent 40 minutes ago. "You still at work?" And then, 10 minutes later, "Viv?" And then, "Okay, I'm going to sleep, just checking." She typed back, "Home soon, sorry," long one, and put her phone away. Marcus was 23. He was brilliant in the particular focused way of someone who had grown up with very little and therefore developed an almost surgical relationship with opportunity. He identified it, evaluated it, and pursued it with the kind of intensity that, under different circumstances, might have alarmed people around him. Under their circumstances, it had gotten him through 2 years of community college and into a conditional acceptance at the University of Illinois Chicago for an engineering program that cost more per semester than Vivian made in 3 months. The conditional part was the problem. The financial part was the larger problem. She'd been covering his first semester with a combination of the small life insurance payout from their mother, which had dwindled to approximately $4,000, and a payment plan arrangement with the university that required her to deposit $800 on the first of every month, a number that functioned in her life the way a large, irregularly shaped piece of furniture functions in a small room. You navigated around it constantly, you never forgot it was there, and occasionally you walked directly into it in the dark. The bus was late. She was not surprised. She stood in the cold and thought about the power bill that had arrived that week, and the fact that her car, which she'd been keeping alive through a combination of mechanic appointments and what she privately thought of as automotive prayer, had developed a new sound in the engine that the automotive prayer was not adequately addressing. She was not a person who indulged in self-pity. She'd decided that at 14, watching her mother work 2 jobs with the focused, unsentimental efficiency of someone who had already processed the unfairness of it and moved past the processing into the doing. Self-pity was a luxury, her mother had said once, not with bitterness, but with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone explaining a rule of physics. You can feel sorry for yourself, or you can fix things, Vivian, but you don't have enough time for both. So she didn't feel sorry for herself. She just stood in the cold and did the math and found that the math, as it often did not work. But the SUVs arrived without warning. That was the first thing that registered. Not the size of them, not the number, not the way they pulled to the curb in a practiced, coordinated silence that suggested military precision or something adjacent to it. What registered first was the absence of sound. Most large vehicles announced themselves. These simply appeared, black and immense against the yellow-orange of the streetlights, 3 of them in a line, engines idling so quietly they seemed to be breathing rather than running. Vivian looked up from her phone. The man in the puffy jacket who had been asleep sitting up was suddenly, inexplicably, no longer at the bus stop. She had not heard him leave. 2 men in dark suits stepped out of the middle vehicle. They were large in the way that suggested purpose rather than accident, the kind of large that came from deliberate construction rather than genetics. They moved with the unhurried efficiency of people who were accustomed to situations resolving themselves in their favor, and positioned themselves on either side of the rear door of the middle SUV in a way that was not aggressive, but was absolutely, unmistakably not casual either. Then the door opened. What emerged first was a wheelchair, sleek, black, mechanical in its sophistication, in a way that suggested it had been custom-built rather than selected from a catalog. The men in suits managed its deployment with practiced efficiency, unfolding it to the sidewalk without apparent effort or discussion. Then the man. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, though the precision of his stillness made him difficult to age with confidence. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that fit with the kind of exactness that meant it had been made for specifically him, and a black overcoat across his shoulders. Not through the sleeves, draped, which should have looked affected and instead looked simply correct for a person who did not need the gesture of buttoning things up against weather to convey that the weather was not a concern of his. His hair was dark, close cut. His jaw was the architectural kind, the kind that photographs well and in person looks almost aggressive in its sharpness. His eyes found her immediately, not in the scanning way of someone searching, in the way of someone who already knew exactly where to look. Vivian did not move. Her brain was doing several things at once. Threat assessment, which was a reflex developed from years of working in a trauma ER in a city that occasionally sent its worst nights through the front doors. Confusion, because nothing about this scenario matched any template she had for how February nights at a Chicago bus stop were supposed to proceed, and something else, something less categorizable. A baseline alertness that felt less like fear and more like the feeling before a large wave, when the water pulls back from the shore and everything goes briefly, unnaturally still. One of the suited men walked toward her. He stopped at a respectful distance, just far enough to signal that he wasn't blocking her path, and said with the particular neutral courtesy of someone delivering a message they had delivered many times before, "Ms. Hale, Mr. Moretti would like a word." The name landed in her chest before her brain fully processed it. Moretti. She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago knew the name, the way everyone in a city knows the names of its geography. Not because they'd sought the knowledge, but because it was simply part of the ambient information of living there. Lucien Moretti. She knew the rumors and the shadows of the rumors, the things that circulated in the particular way that information about genuinely powerful people circulates, not in newspapers, not in anything that could be confirmed or cited, but in the spaces between conversations, in the thing someone's voice does when they mention a name they're slightly afraid to say out loud. She also knew, because she had been the one working when he was brought in 2 years ago, who he was in a different sense entirely. "I have a bus to catch," she said. The man's expression did not change. "Mr. Moretti is aware of your schedule, Ms. Hale. He won't take more than 20 minutes of your time." "He's aware of my schedule." "Yes, ma'am." Vivian looked past the suited man to where Lucien Moretti sat in his wheelchair beside the open SUV door, perfectly composed, watching her with those eyes that had already done their finding and were now simply waiting. He didn't lean forward. He didn't gesture. He showed no impatience whatsoever. He had the stillness of someone who had decided long ago that the universe would accommodate his timing and had been right often enough that the belief had calcified into certainty. She thought about her bus. She thought about the power bill. She thought about Marcus's face when she'd told him the second semester payment was going to be late, the way he'd nodded and said it's fine. Viv with the particular performance of a person who understood that the alternative to it's fine was making things harder for someone who was already working at the edge of their capacity. 20 minutes, she said. The inside of the SUV was warm in a way that felt slightly unreal after the street, a warmth that wasn't just temperature, but quality. The kind of engineered comfort that existed only in things that cost serious money. The seats were leather, charcoal gray. There was no visible clutter, no fast food wrappers, no phone chargers dangling from ports. It smelled faintly of something cedar or something adjacent to cedar, and underneath that, barely perceptible, the particular olfactory ghost of a hospital, antiseptic and mineral, that Vivian recognized the way a person recognizes a neighbor's cologne. She sat across from him. Up close, the damage was visible in ways it wasn't from the sidewalk. Not damage in any dramatic sense, but the particular physical vocabulary of a body that had been through serious trauma and had done the work of surviving it. The way he held his shoulders slightly forward, compensating for something. A faint tension in his jaw that suggested chronic pain managed rather than absent. The hands resting in his lap, which were large and still, and bore the ghost of old scars on the right knuckles that had nothing to do with his injury. She recognized him in the specific way she'd been trying not to think about since she heard his name. 2 years ago, on a night in March, an ambulance had brought in a man with 2 gunshot wounds to the lower back and catastrophic spinal damage. The OR had been backed up. The ER had been chaos. 2 car accidents, a domestic violence call, a cardiac event in a 44-year-old who'd driven himself to the hospital because he was in denial about what was happening to him. Vivian had been assigned the gunshot patient, and she had worked on him for 40 minutes with the focused, emotionless efficiency she deployed in extremis, not thinking about who he was or wasn't, just thinking about the bleed, the pressure, the vitals, the next necessary action. He had survived. He had been polite. This was what she remembered most clearly and what she'd found most disorienting. Not the situation, not the security detail that had materialized in the corridor within minutes of his arrival and had to be gently but firmly redirected to the waiting area, not any of the contextual strangeness of it. What she remembered was that when she was done, when she had done everything that could be done in that bay before the OR became available, she had told him he was stable, and he had looked at her with those same gray eyes, same quality of stillness, and said quietly, "Thank you, I mean that." Not thank you the way people said it automatically. Thank you the way someone said it who had, in the previous 40 minutes, experienced the very specific and clarifying sensation of understanding that they might actually die and having revised, in light of that understanding, their assumptions about what mattered. She had nodded and moved on to the next patient. She had not thought about him again until 30 seconds ago. "You remember me?" he said. It was not a question. "March, 2 years ago, GSW, lumbar vertebrae. I was the admitting nurse. You were the only person in that room who talked to me like I was a person and not a problem." His voice was low, unhurried, with a slight roughness to it. Not accent exactly, more like texture, the vocal equivalent of something that had been through heat. Everyone else looked at the chart, or looked at the security detail, or looked at the floor. You looked at me. I look at all my patients. I know. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. That's why you're here. The SUV had been moving, she realized, not toward anywhere she'd been told, and she felt the small, practical spike of concern that any intelligent person feels when they understand they are traveling in an unfamiliar direction with an unfamiliar person, regardless of how composed that person appears. But they were still in recognizable streets, still in the city, and the suited driver had shown no indication of anything other than destination-oriented driving. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My building. I want to show you something." "You said 20 minutes. I'll have you home by 1. She held his gaze for a moment. He didn't blink, didn't look away, didn't adjust himself. He simply waited with that infuriating, total patience. "If you're planning something dangerous," she said, "I've had a 36-hour shift and I am too tired to be properly afraid. So whatever lesson you're planning to teach will probably land less effectively than intended." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood. "I'm planning to make you an offer," he said. "That's all." He thought. The Moretti building did not announce itself. This was one of the more unsettling things about it. In a city where architectural ambition tended toward self-advertisement, toward glass and angles and the particular visual grammar of significant structure, this building simply stood. 42 floors of dark stone and glass that caught the city's light without returning it, located in the kind of neighborhood where the presence of the extremely wealthy and the extremely dangerous had achieved a long-standing, mutually beneficial détente. They went up in an elevator that required a card and a code, and one of the suited men standing at a particular angle, and Vivian spent the ride looking at the elevator doors and not at Lucien Moretti, and cataloging what she knew, which was, she was in a building owned by a man who was, by the city's open secret, the operating center of a criminal organization that controlled significant portions of Chicago's South and West Side operations, had interests in construction and finance, and things less easily named, and had survived an assassination attempt that had left him in a wheelchair, and according to the rumors that came after, had left several of his rivals significantly more cautious about the assumption that a paralyzed man was a diminished one. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. What Vivian noticed first was not the space, though the space was considerable, the kind of open-plan architecture that happened when the entire top floor of a 42-story building became someone's living area, but the windows. Floor to ceiling, running the entire perimeter of the visible room, and beyond them Chicago. The city at midnight, all lit and sprawling, The grid of streets and the dark interruption of the lake, and the clustered light of downtown, and the spreading, quieter light of the neighborhoods going south and west and north. All of it laid out with the particular generosity of altitude, the way height makes cities legible in a way they never are from inside them. She stood at the window for a moment longer than she intended to. "Sit down," said Lucien Moretti from somewhere behind her. "Please." She turned. He had navigated the wheelchair to a position near a low table on which sat a decanter of whiskey and two glasses, one of which he had already filled. The second he did not fill. He looked at her with the mild inquiry of a man asking a question without speaking it. "I'm fine," she said. "Sit down anyway." She sat because the alternative was standing around being difficult, and she was genuinely too tired for that level of performance. One of the large leather chairs near the window. She kept her coat on. Lucien Moretti studied her for a moment with the frank assessment of someone who had gotten used to looking at people the way other people looked at situations, as variables to be understood rather than presences to be acknowledged. It should have been irritating. Somehow it wasn't quite, because there was nothing aggressive in it, nothing that felt like dominance or ownership, just attention. "How much do you know about my situation?" he said. "The current situation, not the incident. I know what people say, which is that the 5 families think you're weakened, that your own people are uncertain, that the fact of the wheelchair has become a symbol in certain circles, not medically, but politically, of a man whose authority is provisional." She paused. "That's the version I've heard. You'd know better than I would." Something in his expression told her she'd gotten it approximately right. "The assessment is accurate enough," he said. "The reality is that my operations are functioning at 92% of pre-incident capacity. My financial holdings are intact and in several cases expanding, and the men who report to me do so with the same reliability they always have because the consequences of unreliability have not changed." He turned the whiskey glass slightly in his hand. "The problem is perception. The problem is that perception, in my world, has material consequences. When rivals believe you are weakened, they test the belief. When they test it, you spend resources responding to tests rather than to actual interests. It becomes expensive." "Okay," Vivian said. She understood the shape of what was coming. She didn't know the details, but she understood the shape. And she was deciding, in real time, whether she was the kind of person who stood up now and asked to be driven home, or whether she was the kind of person who heard the offer first. "What does this have to do with me?" "I need a wife." The room was quiet enough that she heard the city through the glass. A distant siren, the bass register pulse of the wind. "A public wife," he continued, in the same unhurried tone in which he might have been discussing quarterly projections. 12 months. A legal marriage for the duration. Public appearances at appropriate intervals. Charity events, business functions, social occasions that require a certain presentation. Proof of personal stability. A man with a wife, an intact home life, who is clearly engaged in functioning. That man doesn't read as weakened. That man reads as someone whose personal circumstances are resolved, who is not bleeding out quietly in private while maintaining a facade in public. Vivian looked at him. "A contract marriage," she said. "Yes." "For appearances." "Yes." "And then?" 12 months from the date of signing, the marriage is dissolved, quietly. No contest. You walk away with the financial compensation agreed upon in the contract, full legal representation for anything related to the dissolution, and no further obligation to me or this organization. "What's the number?" For the first time since she'd gotten into the SUV, something in his face registered something she might have called respect. The particular respect of someone who asked the right question. $1.2 million, he said, paid in 3 installments. $400,000 at signing, $400,000 at the 6-month mark, $400,000 on dissolution. The number went through Vivian Hale like cold water. She didn't let it show. She had a face for this. She'd developed it in the ER over years of moments when what she was actually feeling and what it was useful to display were 2 different things, and she used it now. She looked at him steadily and nodded slowly, the way you nod when information is being processed rather than when agreement is being registered. Inside the steadiness, her mind was running the math. $400,000 at signing, Marcus's second and third and fourth semester covered completely. The car, replaced. The power bill. The arrears on the credit card. The 2 months she was behind on her student loan payment because she'd been routing that money to the university. All of it gone. And still $400,000 remaining of the first installment alone. $1.2 million total. The rest of Marcus's degree. A cushion of genuine size for the first time in her adult life. The complete elimination of the specific, chronic, grinding anxiety that had operated as the background noise of every day she'd lived for the past decade. The constant low-level awareness that the math might not work, that the next unexpected expense might be the one she couldn't root around. Her hands, in her lap, were completely still. "Why me?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Because when I was on that table 2 years ago," he said, "you were the only person in the room who treated me like a human being instead of a circumstance. You spoke to me directly. You told me what was happening. You didn't perform pity or professionalism. You were just present." He paused. "I've been in rooms with a significant number of people since then. That quality, the ability to be genuinely present with someone rather than managing them, is rarer than you'd think. You had me investigated. I had you thoroughly investigated. I know your professional record, your financial situation, your family situation. Your character is assessed by the people who work with you and the people who live near you and the people who've known you for years." He met her eyes. "I know that you're honest, that you're stubborn, that you're in a situation that is genuinely difficult through no fault of your own, and that you are the kind of person who can be trusted with information of a sensitive nature. All of those things matter for what I'm proposing." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Outside, Chicago continued its midnight operations, indifferent and vast. "There are rules," she said. "If I agreed, which I haven't." "Name them." "My brother is not involved in this in any way. He doesn't know the details. He doesn't come near your operations. He doesn't become a person your world takes an interest in." "Agreed." "I keep working." A brief pause. "That may require some scheduling discussion. The public appearances." "I keep working," she repeated. "Part-time if necessary, but I don't stop. That's non-negotiable." Something moved in his expression. Not irritation, she thought. Something more like recognition. "Agreed." "I have my own room, my own space in whatever arrangement we're living. I'm not a—" She chose the next word with some care. "I'm not an accessory. I'm present when required, I perform whatever the public role requires, and the rest of the time I'm a person with my own life. Understood?" "And if something feels unsafe," she said, "I leave. Immediately. No contractual obligation overrides my safety or my brother's." Lucien Moretti looked at her for a long moment. "I protect what's mine," he said. "That would include you for the duration of the arrangement. You have my word on that." "Your word," she said, and let the weight of what that word cost sit in the sentence without pressing it. "Yes," he said simply. Vivian stood up. She walked to the window and looked at the city for a long moment. The spread of it, the scale of it, the 12,000 feet of lit streets going in every direction from where she stood. She thought about her mother navigating 2 jobs with the unsentimental efficiency of someone who had already processed the unfairness and moved past it into the doing. She thought about Marcus saying, "It's fine," Viv with that particular performance of a person trying not to make someone else's load heavier. She thought about Darius on her table tonight, 22 years old with 2 holes in his abdomen and no ID and a mother keening quietly in the hallway outside. She thought about 36 hours on her feet and a broken car and a bus stop in February and the number 1.2 million sitting in the room behind her like a door that had appeared in a wall. She turned around. "I want a lawyer," she said. "My own. Not yours. I'll have them review the contract before I sign anything." Lucie Moretti nodded. "I'll have a list of independent firms to you by morning, and I want to meet with you again before I decide. Here, or somewhere neutral. I want to ask questions and I want honest answers." "Yes." "I haven't said yes." "I know." And for the first time, unambiguously, the corner of his mouth moved into something that was actually recognizably a smile. Small, real, carrying within it the particular texture of a man who had been surprised by something and found the surprise not entirely unwelcome. "But you're still here." Vivian looked at him. She thought about a lot of things in that moment, standing 42 floors above the city with a mafia boss watching her from a wheelchair, with the patient, absolute stillness of someone who had decided that whatever happened next would happen at her pace and not his. She thought that the last time she'd felt this particular quality of fear and aliveness simultaneously was the first time she'd worked a code blue alone, when the attending had been 3 minutes out and the patient was 3 seconds from gone, and she had simply done what needed doing with every resource she had. She thought that either decision she made in the next 30 seconds would change her life in ways she could not fully predict. She thought about the bus stop and the cold and the math that didn't work. "I'll look at the contract," she said. She left it at that. But as the elevator descended and the suited men arranged her return journey, and the city scrolled past the tinted SUV windows in its midnight iteration, Vivian Hale sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed and felt, underneath the composure, the particular bone-deep recognition of someone who already knows what they're going to do, who has, in fact, already decided, but needs the small mercy of a night's sleep before they can say it out loud. The contract was on her kitchen table when she got home. Her lawyer called her at 9 the next morning. "It's tight," her lawyer said. "Professionally drafted, genuinely enforceable. The financial guarantees are secured through legitimate holding companies. The NDAs are aggressive but standard for someone in his position. The exit clause is clean." Vivian stood at her kitchen window, looking at the street below. Marcus was still asleep. The apartment was quiet. "Is there anything in it that's designed to trap me?" she asked. A pause. "Not that I can find, which doesn't mean there isn't something I'm missing. But as written? No. It reads like someone who genuinely wants the arrangement to function and is willing to make it secure enough that you'd be comfortable agreeing to it." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She put the phone down. She looked at the contract on the table for a long time, at the clean lines of it, the orderly clauses, the blank signature line at the bottom with her name typed beneath it in small, precise letters. Vivian Claire Hale. Her whole name, all 3 parts of it, like an introduction she hadn't given. She picked up a pen. She set it down again. She went and made coffee. She came back. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway around 10, sleep-creased and squinting, wearing the other Northwestern sweatshirt. He had 2, she had stolen one, and stopping when he saw the papers on the table with the professional density of a legal document. "What's that?" "Nothing," she said. "Job stuff. Go back to sleep." He looked at her with the particular sideways assessment of a younger sibling who has spent his entire life reading the person responsible for him and has gotten quite good at it. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I worked a long shift." "Viv." "Marcus." He looked at the papers for another moment, then at her. Then he padded to the cabinet and got a bowl and the cereal and sat down at the other end of the table and poured his breakfast with the elaborate casualness of someone who has decided not to press an issue, but also is not pretending the issue doesn't exist. They ate in the particular, comfortable silence of people who have lived in close quarters for years and no longer need noise to fill the space between them. When Marcus finished, he put his bowl in the sink, paused in the doorway, and said, without turning around, "Whatever it is, you don't have to do it alone." Vivian looked at his back. "Go to class," she said. He went. She sat alone at the kitchen table in the apartment where she'd lived for 4 years, in the city where she'd spent her whole life, with a pen in her hand and a decision in front of her that she had, if she was being honest with herself, already made. She picked up the pen. She signed the contract. And 3 weeks later, in a stone building 42 floors above Chicago, with candles burning in sconces along the walls and armed men stationed at every entrance, Vivian Claire Hale became, in the eyes of the law and no one else who needed to know, the wife of Lucien Moretti. She stood beside him in a dress she'd chosen herself. Deep blue, simple, nothing she could have afforded on a nurse's salary, and listened to the words that made the arrangement legal, and felt the cool weight of a ring being placed on her finger with the careful, impersonal precision of a man fulfilling a clause in a document. She told herself, 1 year. She told herself, this is a transaction, and transactions have endings, and the ending of this one would mean that Marcus was secure, and the math would finally work and she would get her life back. She told herself all of this, and then the officiant finished speaking, and Lucien Moretti turned his gray eyes toward her and looked at her. Not the way a man looks at a contractual arrangement, but the way a man looks at something that has just become complicated. And Vivian felt, underneath the composed surface of everything she was telling herself, the first small, dangerous stirring of doubt. The penthouse was quiet at midnight. Vivian stood at the window in the room that was hers, large, spare, the kind of room that had been designed by someone with excellent taste and very clear instructions that it should communicate nothing personal, and looked at the city that had, in the space of 3 weeks, become the view from her life. Down the hall, behind a closed door, the man she had married on a contract was either sleeping or working or sitting in the particular darkness she had already, in the few days since the wedding, begun to associate with him. The darkness he chose rather than the darkness that happened to him. The deliberate chosen solitude of someone who had been living with something painful for long enough that he'd organized his life around accommodating it rather than addressing it. She had not pressed. The contract specified no emotional obligation. She was an emergency room nurse. She understood better than most that the distance people kept from their pain was usually not stubbornness or character failure, but simple endurance. The gap between how much something hurt and how much capacity a person had to look at it directly. She was not looking at him. She was not thinking about the way he'd looked at her when the officiant finished speaking. She was looking at Chicago, at the city she'd spent her entire life in and never seen from this angle, and telling herself the things she needed to tell herself, and listening to the apartment settle around her with the small sounds of a place that had not yet decided what she was to it. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. How's the new place? She looked at the message for a moment. She typed back, big windows, 3 dots. Then, LOL, okay, get some sleep. She put the phone down. Somewhere in the building, very faintly, she heard something. A sound she needed a moment to identify, and then did. Glass breaking. And then silence, immediate and total, the kind that followed things rather than preceded them. Vivian stood still for a moment. Then she opened her door and walked down the hall toward the sound. The broken glass was a whiskey tumbler. Vivian found it in pieces across the floor of Lucien's study, not the formal office she'd been shown during the brief businesslike tour of the penthouse on her first night. But the smaller room at the end of the east corridor that she'd understood instinctively was the real one. The room where actual things happened rather than the room where they were presented. The door had been ajar. The sound had been the tumbler meeting the hardwood floor at the base of the window, and the silence after it was the silence of a room in which someone had decided not to react to the thing they'd just done. Lucien sat with his back partially toward her, the wheelchair angled toward the window and the city beyond it. His jacket was off. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows in a way that looked less like deliberate casualness and more like a man who had been sitting in one position for a very long time and had made incremental adjustments without noticing them. On the desk behind him, 3 separate phones displayed lit screens. A stack of papers had been pushed to one side with enough force that the bottom third of the stack had fanned out across the desk surface. He had not moved when she came in. "You don't have to clean it up," he said. His voice was level. Whatever had caused the tumbler to become a projectile had already been processed and filed somewhere behind the composure. "I'm not going to clean it up," Vivian said. "I just heard the sound." A pause. "Go back to bed." "I wasn't in bed." He turned the wheelchair slightly, not enough to face her fully, just enough that she moved from his peripheral vision to something more direct. In the half-light from the desk lamp and the ambient glow of the city through the window, she could see the tension in his jaw, the particular set of his shoulders that she was already, after less than a week, beginning to learn. The way his body carried things, his face refused to show. "There was a meeting tonight," he said, "before you were home." She hadn't known there'd been a meeting. She'd been at the hospital for a partial shift. She'd negotiated 3 days a week, which had felt like a victory at the time, and had come back to a penthouse that seemed the same as she'd left it, except for the quality of silence, which had a different texture than usual. She hadn't asked. "Okay," she said. "The Callahan organization sent a representative." He said it the way someone reads from a list, informative, precise, and beneath the precision, something that had been dealt with internally and was now being reported rather than felt. "Their position is that the marriage changes nothing, that it's a performance, that I'm managing optics rather than demonstrating actual operational capacity." "What do you want me to say to that?" "Nothing." I'm telling you because it affects the schedule for the next several weeks. There will be more public appearances than originally planned, dinner with specific people, a function at the Harlow next Friday that will be attended by 3 of the 5 family representatives. He paused. You'll need to be present, comfortable, convincing. Vivian looked at him. Convincing, she said. Yes. As a wife. As a wife who is present by choice rather than obligation. There's a difference, and people in that room will be looking for it. She should have said yes, noted the schedule, gone back to her room. That was the contract. That was the arrangement they'd made, clearly and in writing, with the full deliberate participation of her adult judgment. Instead, she said, "What did they actually say, the representative?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. He said a man who needed a wife to stabilize his image was a man whose image couldn't stabilize itself. The flatness in his voice when he said it was the flatness of something that had been stripped of its surface layer by repetition, the way a word loses meaning if you say it enough times. He said it in front of 4 other people. Vivian was quiet. Outside, the city held its 1 a.m. configuration, the particular balance of movement and stillness that belonged to that hour, the last bars and the first deliveries and the long middle of the night, where the streets belonged to people who worked them rather than passed through them. He's not wrong about the optics, she said finally. Lucian's head turned toward her with the particular controlled speed of someone who had expected almost anything except that. I'm not saying he's right about you, she continued before he could speak. I'm saying that if the argument is that this looks like image management, the counter-argument isn't to do more image management. It's to give people something real to observe. She paused. I'm a nurse. I'm not from this world. I have no reason to be here except that I'm here. That's either a liability or it's the most convincing thing you've got, depending on how it's used. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before it. You've been thinking about this, he said. I've been thinking about a lot of things. She moved to the doorway threshold. I'll be at the function Friday. Tell me what you need me to know about the people in the room, and I'll learn it. She left him there. She went back to her room and lay on top of the covers with her shoes still on and stared at the ceiling and thought about the look on his face when she'd said he's not wrong about the optics. The way something had cracked open, fractionally, in the set of his expression, like a fault line showing itself briefly before the ground resettled. She thought about how she was already, 6 days in, doing the things she told herself she wouldn't do, looking too closely. Chasim. The Harlow was the kind of venue that had been someone's private club in a previous decade and had retained, through several ownership changes and one complete interior renovation, the atmosphere of a place where important things were decided over drinks by people who did not need to raise their voices to be understood. Vivian wore black. She'd been given a budget for the evening's appearance and had spent approximately a quarter of it purchasing a dress that was elegant without announcing itself in heels that she practiced walking in for 45 minutes in the penthouse hallway on Thursday evening while Lucien sat at the far end of the corridor going through documents and pretending with entirely unconvincing neutrality that he was not observing her. You're watching me practice walking, she said on her 4th pass. I'm reading. You haven't turned a page in 8 minutes. A pause, then, without looking up, your left shoulder drops when you adjust your balance. It'll be less visible if you lead with your hip on the right side. Vivian stopped, considered this, tried it. The adjustment was small and immediate and correct, and she was irritated in the specific way of someone receiving useful advice from an unexpected source. Thank you, she said, with the particular delivery of someone for whom the thank you is genuine and the irritation is separate and both can coexist. He turned a page. But the function at the Harlow had 47 attendees, of whom Vivian had memorized the names and relevant backgrounds of 12, the 12 being, as Lucien had identified them in a briefing that had felt less like a social preparation and more like a tactical assessment, the people whose observations would carry weight in the circles that mattered. She had studied the list with the same focused attention she brought to a new medication protocol or an unfamiliar presentation in triage, not because she was afraid, but because she was thorough. And thoroughness was the mechanism by which she managed fear well enough that it didn't run things. Lucien moved through the room with the ease of someone for whom the wheelchair had become, over 2 years, not an obstacle, but a different kind of presence. Lower, which meant people came to him rather than him going to them. which meant he chose the angles and the conversations were always subtly on his terms. She had noticed this in the penthouse. Here, in a room full of people who were watching for weakness, it read as something else entirely. It read as stillness. It read as the particular, unhurried quality of a man who did not need to circulate because the room already belonged to him. She stayed close but not attached. This had been his instruction, close enough to read as a unit, far enough that she had her own conversations, her own presence in the room that was not derivative of his. It was during one of those independent conversations, with a woman named Elise Marchetti, whose husband ran legitimate commercial real estate holdings, that Vivian understood to be the clean exterior of something less clean, and who had the particular watchful warmth of someone taking a very accurate social reading while appearing to simply make pleasant conversation, that the first difficult thing happened. "You're a nurse," Elise said. "Emergency room, Chicago Memorial. Still working? 3 days a week." Vivian smiled the way she'd practiced. Not the performance smile, which was a different thing, but the genuine one scaled down to appropriate social volume. "Old habits. Lucienne allows that?" The word allows landed with a particular, deliberate weight. Vivian heard it the way she heard things in the ER when she needed to. Fully, without reacting before she'd processed. "He doesn't allow or disallow what I do," she said pleasantly. "We discussed it and agreed." She picked up her glass. "We're partners. That's how it works." Elise Marchetti looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone revising a preliminary assessment. "He's different," she said. Not a challenge. An observation offered carefully, like something being set down rather than thrown. "From what?" "From before." A pause. "I knew Lucien before the injury. He was—" She searched briefly. "He was effective, controlled, brilliant even, in the way of someone who saw every angle before anyone else in the room knew there were angles." She glanced across the room to where Lucien was in low-voiced conversation with two men whose names Vivian recognized from the briefing as Callahan affiliates. "He's still all of that, but there's something different now, something that wasn't there before." Vivian followed her gaze. "What do you think it is?" she asked. Elise Marchetti smiled the smile of a woman who had been paying attention to powerful men for a very long time and had learned the specific value of not saying everything she knew. "Ask him," she said, and drifted away into the room. Tap. The drive back to the penthouse was quiet. The city moved past the windows in its nighttime configuration, and Lucienne sat across from her in the SUV with the posture of a man performing the decompression of a difficult evening. Not visibly, not in any way that would have been obvious to anyone watching, but to Vivian, who had spent 4 years learning to read what bodies were doing when people weren't paying attention to them. It was apparent in the exact set of his shoulders, and the way his hands rested in his lap with slightly too much deliberateness. "Elise Marchetti talked to you," he said, "for about 10 minutes. What did she say?" "She said you're different than before." Vivian looked at him. What was she comparing to? A pause that lasted long enough to have a shape. "Before the injury," he said, "I ran things differently. There was less—" He stopped, started again with a different angle. "I was less careful about the cost of things. I made decisions quickly, and I made them based on what was necessary rather than what was sustainable. There were people who paid for those decisions in ways I didn't fully account for at the time. And after, I had approximately 4 months lying in a hospital bed with nothing to do except account for them. The flatness was back, but a different kind. Not the stripped surface flatness from before, but something more deliberate, like a scar that had been examined enough times to be no longer surprising. Elise's husband is one of the people whose operation I consolidated in a way that benefited me and cost him significantly. He still works with me. The arrangement is functional, but she remembers. So she was warning me. Or assessing you. Possibly both." He looked at the window. "She's perceptive. She said to ask you what was different." Silence. "And?" he said. "I'm asking." The SUV moved through the city. The driver's partition was up. Outside, a light turned red, and the vehicle slowed, and the red washed briefly into the interior, coloring everything the same temporary shade. "The injury took something," Lucien said. "The obvious things, mobility, the physical capacity I'd operated with my whole adult life. Those were the surface. A pause. What it actually took was the certainty, the absolute operational certainty that I could handle anything that came at me because I'd always been able to. That certainty was... He looked at his hands. It turned out it wasn't a quality I'd developed. It was a thing I'd assumed I had and never tested properly. And when it was tested... You found out it wasn't certainty, Vivian said. It was just the absence of the right challenge. He looked at her. Yes, he said. The light changed. The SUV moved forward. That's not a weakness, she said. In my world, that's not a weakness, she repeated. Not louder, just more precisely. A person who finds out what they're actually made of under pressure isn't diminished by that. They're informed by it. What they do with the information is the thing that matters. Lucien Moretti looked at her with the particular, careful attention of a man who was reassessing the nature of the conversation he was in. You talk to your patients like this, he said, when they need it. I'm not a patient. No, she agreed. But you're doing the same thing they do when they've been hurt and they're scared and they've had a long time to sit with it. You're confusing what happened to you with what you are. She looked out the window. Most people do. It doesn't mean you have to keep doing it. The penthouse, when they arrived, was quiet. 3 days later was when the first real fracture appeared. It came without ceremony, the way significant things often do, embedded in the ordinary sequence of an ordinary afternoon, arriving in the shape of something small and specific that turned out to be the visible surface of something much larger underneath. Vivian was in the kitchen, a room she had, without consciously deciding to, begun to occupy with increasing frequency, partly because it had better light than most of the penthouse, and partly because it was the one room that seemed to have no operational significance, no tactical weight, no aura of decisions made and consequences pending. It was just a kitchen. Someone had clearly used it at some point, though not recently, and the organization of it was clinical enough that Vivian suspected its most frequent visitor was the housekeeper. She was making coffee and reading through clinical notes on her phone. She tried to stay current, keep her skills from softening during the reduced hours. When she heard Lucien's voice from the corridor, he was on the phone. She was not trying to listen. But the penthouse had the acoustic characteristic of a space designed for privacy that had never been tested against two residents rather than one, and his voice carried through the open kitchen doorway in a way that delivered specific phrases whether she intended to receive them or not. The second installment goes through the Cayman account on the 15th. Marcello handles the Hale transfer separately, outside the main ledger. Vivian went still. She stood with her coffee half made and her phone in her hand and heard the rest of the sentence, which was logistical and specific and entirely businesslike, and which described in the precise language of financial operations she'd learned enough about in the past 2 weeks to follow the mechanism by which her payments, her contractual payments, the money that was paying for Marcus's education and clearing her debt and buying her the version of the future she'd been working toward for a decade, were being routed. She already knew the money was organized through his financial structures. Her lawyer had explained this, had said the holding companies were legitimate, had said the guarantees were secured. What she hadn't heard, before this moment, was the specific, mundane business-like tone in which her life was categorized as a line item. The Hale transfer, outside the main ledger, main. She knew it was rational. She knew it was simply how large financial operations worked. She knew there was nothing in what she'd heard that contradicted anything she'd agreed to. She also stood in the kitchen and felt something that she did not immediately name, but that she recognized after a moment, as the specific discomfort of a person who has, for 2 weeks, been in close proximity to someone and has been adjusting, without fully acknowledging the adjustment, to thinking of them as a person rather than a party to a contract, and who has now been reminded abruptly that the framing was contractual first and everything else second. Lucien appeared in the kitchen doorway. He saw her face. He knew immediately, with the particular acute situational awareness of a man who had spent his entire adult life reading rooms, that something had shifted. "What?" he said. Not a question. A door opening. Nothing. "Vivian, I heard part of a phone call." She kept her voice level. "I wasn't listening. The door was open. I heard enough to be reminded of how this works, which is fine, because I already knew how this works, and I agreed to it. The quality of his stillness changed. Which part? The Hale transfer, she said, outside the main ledger. The silence that followed had a texture she hadn't encountered in him before. Not the controlled silence he deployed in rooms full of people. Not the chosen solitude she'd learned to read as his default, but something more uncomfortable. Something that looked, from the inside of her considerably developed ability, to read what bodies were doing when people weren't managing their presentation. Like a man who had been caught being precisely what he'd told her from the beginning he was, and who was experiencing something complicated about being caught. That's the structure my financial team established for the arrangement, he said. I know. It protects both parties. The separation from the main accounts means, I know, she said again, and something in the second repetition stopped him more effectively than the first. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm not renegotiating. I heard something that reminded me of a thing I already knew, and I'm having a feeling about it, which is, she paused, a normal human response that doesn't require fixing. He looked at her for a long moment. I don't know how to do this, he said. Do what? This. A brief, almost imperceptible gesture that managed to indicate the kitchen and both of them and the space between them without being dramatic about it. I know how to run an organization. I know how to structure agreements and manage relationships where everyone's interests are explicit and the terms are clear. I don't know how to... He stopped. I don't know the protocol for what's in between. Vivian looked at him. There isn't a protocol, she said. That's the point. That's not helpful. No, she agreed. It's not. She poured her coffee and went back to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed and held the mug in both hands and thought about the way he'd said, I don't know how to do this, with the particular undefended honesty of a man who had run out of the energy required to manage his presentation and had said a true thing instead. She thought about how that was the most frightening thing he'd said to her since the night she met him. The call from Marcus came on a Wednesday afternoon. She was in the middle of a shift at the hospital, Bay 4, a laceration case, nothing urgent, when her phone buzzed in her pocket with his name on the screen. She finished the case, washed up, and called him back from the corridor near the break room, which was moderately private. What's wrong? She said, because Marcus called her at work for two reasons. Something was wrong, or something was very right, and his contact name on her screen never produced the calm of the second category until she'd verified it wasn't the first. Nothing's wrong. A pause. I mean, something's not wrong, but it's... I need to tell you something. Marcus, I got a call from someone at the university, financial aid office. He paused again, and in the pause she heard the particular, careful calibration of someone who is deciding how much information to deploy in what order. They told me a payment was received on my account. A large payment. Vivian went still in the corridor. How large? She said. The full amount, both remaining semesters plus the engineering program deposit for next year. His voice was doing something complicated. Gratitude and confusion braided together, neither one winning. Viv, what did you do? I told you, new job. This isn't a new job. This is... He stopped. The financial aid office said the transfer came from a holding company in the Cayman Islands. Cayman Islands, Viv. I Googled the company name. It doesn't come up. It just doesn't come up at all, which means... It means it's a structured financial vehicle, and the lack of public records is normal for that type of entity, she said, with the careful precision of someone who has recently learned more than they ever intended to about the mechanics of financial structuring. Marcus, your tuition is paid. Your housing is covered. That's what matters. Who are you working for? A private client. What kind of private client pays in Cayman transfers for nursing services? Marcus, are you safe? The question landed differently than she expected it to. Not the alarm she'd prepared for, not the interrogation she'd been managing, just that. The fundamental, stripped-down question underneath all the others. She leaned against the corridor wall. Down the hall, the break room TV was murmuring something about the weather. Yes, she said. I'm safe. You'd tell me if you weren't. I would. A long pause. I don't like not knowing, he said. I know, but I trust you. He said it with the simplicity of something that had been decided a long time ago and didn't require re-examination. I trust you. So, Vivian closed her eyes for a moment. Go to class, she said. Already there, he said, and she could hear, just barely, the reluctant edge of a smile in it. She hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment longer than she needed to, feeling the weight of 3 different things pressing on her from 3 different directions. The arrangement and Marcus, and the thing she was not naming that was happening in the penthouse in the space between the contract and the person she was beginning, against her considerable better judgment, to know. She went back to work. It was 11:30 that night when she came home to raised voices. Not shouting. The men in Lucien's world didn't shout. She had already learned that much. It was worse than shouting. It was the low-controlled, pressurized register of people who were furious and had decided to remain in complete command of the volume, which meant all the force of it was in the words rather than the delivery. She stood in the entrance hall and listened without meaning to. The Harlow was a mistake. A voice she didn't recognize, deep, older, carrying the weight of someone who was accustomed to being heard when he spoke. You put her in front of them before she was ready. Marchetti's wife talked to her for 12 minutes, and you had no control over that conversation. I was 15 feet away. You had no control over it, Lucien. That's the point. In 12 minutes, an untrained civilian who has been in this world for 2 weeks was assessed by one of the sharpest women connected to the Marchetti organization, and you didn't know what was being said until it was already said. A pause. That's exposure. She handled it. She handled it. The repetition was deliberate. You're describing this woman's performance in an unsupervised social interaction as successful risk management, and you sound like a man who has started thinking with something other than his head. Silence. Her background is clean, Lucien said. Her motivations are clear. The contract is secure. Her motivations. A pause that contained something heavier than irritation, something closer to concern, the kind that comes from someone who has watched a person they are responsible to make a particular category of error before and is watching the opening moves of the same pattern. 3 weeks ago, she was a nurse at a public hospital. Now she's in the Harlow, running independent conversations with Marchetti affiliates installed in the penthouse, and you're telling me her motivations are clear. Based on what, exactly? Based on 2 years of thorough investigation? Investigation tells you what a person was. It doesn't tell you what they become when you put them inside your life. The older voice was quiet now, which was somehow more pointed than the pressure that had preceded it. I've been with you since before your father. I watched what happened last time you let someone get close enough to change how you moved. I am telling you, as someone who has earned the right to tell you this, that the way you talked about Friday's function was not the way a man talks about a business arrangement, and that's a problem. Vivian stood in the entrance hall. She wasn't breathing particularly loudly, but she was suddenly, acutely aware of every sound she was making, of the coat she had not yet taken off, and the bag she had not yet set down, and the completely unintentional but nevertheless total nature of the information she was currently receiving. This conversation is over, Lucien said, quiet, final, the tone that ended things. A pause. I hope she's worth it, the older voice said, and then the sound of someone standing, the particular weight shift of a large man moving toward an exit. Vivian stepped backward, quietly, and made a small noise coming in through the front door, her key in the lock, her bag against the wall. Enough sound to establish presence before the man from the study appeared in the main corridor. He was older than she'd expected from the voice, mid-60s, built like someone who had spent decades in rooms where physical capability was a relevant variable and had maintained it with the grim consistency of professional obligation. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her for a long moment, not hostile, not warm, the look of someone taking a measurement and reserving judgment on the result. Ms. Hale, he said, and his tone was exactly neutral in the specific way of someone who has decided that the neutral is itself a message. Hi, she said. He left. She stood in the entrance hall for another moment, then walked toward the study. Lucien was by the window. He heard her coming. He always heard her coming. She had noticed that early on, the quality of attention he deployed even when his back was turned. But he didn't move. How much did you hear? He said. Enough. A pause. Sal has been with me for a long time, he said. He has opinions about risk. He has opinions about me. He has opinions about the situation. A slight turn of the wheelchair. He's not wrong to have them. Vivian looked at him. In the window light and the low desk lamp, he looked tired in a way he usually didn't. The control was intact, but the energy behind it was thinner, like something running closer to reserve than it usually ran. "Is he right?" she asked. "That you've started thinking with something other than your head?" The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. "I think," Lucien said carefully, "that the line between what this is and what it's becoming is less clear than I intended it to be." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the contract on the kitchen table. She thought about Marcus's voice asking, "Are you safe with that stripped-down simplicity?" She thought about the Harlow and Elise Marchetti's careful, pointed observation, and the way Lucien had moved through that room with the particular stillness of a man who had rebuilt himself into something more controlled and more dangerous, and possibly, underneath the control, more fragile than anything he'd been before. She thought about the fact that she had 6 months left on a 12-month agreement, and that she had, without deciding to, begun to map the layout of this penthouse the way she mapped the layout of the ER, the exits and the dangerous places and the spots where people needed something even when they weren't asking for it. "That's a problem," she said. "Yes," he said, "for both of us." He looked at her. "Yes," he said again, quieter this time, and the word landed in the room with the particular irreversible weight of something acknowledged, a thing named and therefore real now and no longer possible to walk back from. Vivian stood in the doorway. She should say the practical thing, the contractual thing, the thing that rebuilt the wall that had been, quietly, and without either of them fully authorizing it, coming down one brick at a time over 3 weeks of close proximity and late nights and conversations that had no business being as honest as they'd been. She stood in the doorway and said nothing, and then her phone buzzed in her pocket. Not Marcus this time, but the hospital, and the specific extension she recognized as triage, which meant someone needed something immediately, and the decision of what to do about the room she was standing in and the man she was standing across from would have to wait. She answered it. She turned and walked toward her room for her bag. Behind her, she heard Lucien say something, quietly, low, directed at the floor or the window or the city or nothing in particular rather than at her. But the corridor had already swallowed the words by the time she reached them, and she didn't turn back to ask him to repeat it. She went to the hospital. She worked until 4 in the morning, and when she came home, she stood in the entrance hall in the dark and heard, from the end of the east corridor, the faint and unmistakable sound of Lucien still awake, the low voice of a phone call, the occasional shift of the wheelchair, the city-lit quiet of a man who did not sleep much and had, apparently, more to stay awake for than she'd realized. She stood there long enough for the choice to become visible. Then she walked down the hall toward the light. The light under the study door was still on. Vivian stood in the corridor at 4:17 in the morning, with her coat still on and her hospital badge clipped to the front pocket of her scrubs, and the particular bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had spent the last 4 hours in a trauma bay and the hour before that standing in the same corridor making a decision she still hadn't fully articulated to herself. She knocked. Not loudly, just enough. A pause. Then, "Come in." He was at the desk. The phones were dark now, all 3 of them, and the papers had been reorganized into something more deliberate than the fanned-out disorder she'd found 2 nights ago. He had a single glass of water in front of him, which she noticed because it was water rather than whiskey, and a legal pad covered in handwriting so small and dense it looked less like notes and more like a person thinking on paper. He looked at her, at the coat, the badge, the hour registered on his face without comment. "Rough one?" he said. "Pediatric case." She didn't elaborate. Some nights didn't elaborate well. "You're still up." "I don't sleep much." "I know." She came in and sat in the chair across from the desk, the same chair she'd sat in the first night she'd come in here after the broken glass, and she noticed that the geography of it had shifted, that sitting here now felt less like entering a space that belonged to him and more like returning to a space they'd both been in before. "What you said, before I left. In the hallway." He looked at her steadily. "I said the line is less clear than I intended it to be." After that, a pause. "I said I wasn't sure that was a problem anymore," he said. Quiet. Direct. The tone of a man who had spent 4 hours alone deciding whether to say a thing, and had decided. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "It might still be," she said. "I know. I'm not saying it isn't real. I'm saying I don't know what to do with real when real is inside of this." She gestured, not dramatically, just a small indication of the room and what the room represented. What we are to each other on paper and what's happening in this apartment are two different things, and I don't know how to hold both without one of them breaking. "Neither do I," he said. "That's not reassuring." "No," the corner of his mouth. "But it's honest." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she did something she hadn't planned, which was to reach across the desk and pick up the legal pad and look at what he'd been writing. He let her, which was its own kind of answer. It was numbers, mostly. Financial projections, operational notes, a structural diagram of something she didn't have the vocabulary to fully read. But at the bottom of the second page, separate from the rest, 4 words written and then crossed out and then rewritten. What happens after this? She set the pad down. Neither of them said anything. Outside, Chicago was doing its pre-dawn thing, the hour when the night crowd had gone and the morning crowd hadn't arrived, and the city belonged briefly, completely, to its own mechanics. "Get some sleep," she said finally. "Both of us." She stood up. At the door, she paused. "Lucien." He looked up. "The line being unclear," she said. "I'm not telling you that's nothing." She went to her room. She lay down with her coat still on and was asleep in under 4 minutes. The call came on a Thursday morning, 12 days later. Vivian was in the kitchen when she heard Sal's voice in the corridor. The older man had been in the penthouse twice since the night she'd overheard them arguing, and each time he'd moved through the space with the specific measured quality of someone performing a function and not extending the visit beyond the function's requirements. He acknowledged her with the same precisely neutral courtesy as the first time. She acknowledged him the same way back. They had achieved a functional détente built entirely on mutual recognition that they were both important to the same person and that this was the full extent of their commonality. She poured her coffee and did not listen. But Lucien's voice, when it came, had a register she hadn't heard before. Not anger. Something tighter than anger. Something that had gone past the stage where anger is still producing heat and into the colder place beyond it. She stayed in the kitchen. 10 minutes later, Lucien appeared in the doorway. She looked at him. His face was composed. It was always composed. But she had learned, in 6 weeks of close proximity, the specific vocabulary of what composed looked like on him when nothing was wrong versus what it looked like when something was significantly wrong, and he had decided that his face was not going to report it. This was the second kind. "There's something you need to know," he said. She set her coffee down. "What?" The information arrived in pieces, the way bad information usually did. Not as a clean revelation, but as a sequence of facts that each meant something on their own and meant something catastrophically larger in combination. 3 weeks before Vivian signed the contract, a man named Daniel Forsyth had approached the Callahan organization with a proposal. Forsyth was a mid-level operator in a financial network that had been, at various points over the past decade, loosely affiliated with Moretti interests. Not an employee, not an enemy, the kind of adjacent figure that large criminal organizations accumulated the way legitimate businesses accumulated vendors. Useful, present, not fully trusted, not fully cut loose. Forsyth's proposal to the Callahans was this. Lucien Moretti's marriage was a vulnerability, not a strength. A woman brought in from outside with no ties to the organization, with a brother at a public university and a paper trail of financial difficulty and a demonstrated pattern of making decisions under economic pressure. That woman was a door. And Forsyth, who had spent 3 weeks cultivating a connection to Marcus Hale through a series of interactions Marcus had understood as a potential job opportunity, had that door most of the way open. Sal laid it out on the desk in front of Lucien without editorializing. 3 photographs. A recorded phone call. A document that detailed Forsyth's approach to Marcus. The lunches, the conversations about the engineering program, the gradual, careful construction of a relationship that Marcus had reported to Vivian only as a guy I met through a campus recruiter who might have an internship lead, and which Vivian had not flagged because she had not known to flag it. Vivian sat across from Lucien and read the documents and felt the floor move. Not metaphorically. the physical sensation of her equilibrium destabilizing, the inner ear's small, precise report of a world that had shifted on its axis. "How long have you known?" she said. "Sal confirmed it this morning. He's been tracking Forsyth for 11 days. Lucian's voice was entirely level. "I wanted complete information before I brought it to you." "Marcus." She was already standing. "I need to—" "Marcus is currently in his 9 o'clock lecture. He is physically safe. I have 2 people in the vicinity of the campus who have been there for the past 11 days. A pause. "He doesn't know they're there." Vivian stopped. She turned and looked at Lucian. "Hold. You've had people watching my brother for 11 days and you didn't tell me." "I needed to understand the full scope before—" "For 11 days." Her voice was quiet. Quieter than she intended, which meant it was carrying something that volume would have diluted. "He is my brother. He is the one person in this arrangement I made explicitly, contractually clear was off limits. And for 11 days you have had people in his vicinity and you made a unilateral decision that I didn't need to know. I was protecting him. You were managing information. Those are different things." She could feel her hands at her sides, and she made a deliberate decision to keep them still. "What else have you managed? What else in this building, in this arrangement, have you decided I didn't need to know while you were deciding what was best?" The silence was short and total. "Vivian, answer the question." Lucien looked at her. In his eyes, behind the composure and behind the intelligence and behind the carefully maintained architecture of a man who controlled things because control was what kept everything from collapsing, she saw it. The same thing she'd seen in the SUV on the first night, the thing she'd read in him before she knew enough to name it. He had known he was wrong to wait. He had done it anyway. And he was not, in this moment, going to pretend otherwise. "There's a secondary consideration," he said. She waited. Forsyth's approach to Marcus was not random. He was directed to Marcus by someone who knew the specific financial structure of the contract, the Cayman routing, the Hale transfer designation. That information was not public. It was not available to anyone outside of my financial team and legal counsel. A pause. "And one other person who reviewed the contract terms." Vivian stared at him. "Who?" she said. "My former attorney, Vincent Carrera. He left my counsel 6 weeks ago. I was told it was a private matter, a relocation. What Sal confirmed this morning is that Carrera was approached by the Callahan organization 4 months ago, before I approached you, before the contract existed." His jaw was very tight. "He was in place before I made the decision to proceed with this arrangement. He was the one who recommended your name." The room was very quiet. "He recommended me," she said slowly. "He was the one who brought the Moretti Memorial ER connection to my attention. He framed it as a routine background review, names of medical personnel present during my hospitalization. I reviewed the list myself and I selected you based on what I found." Lucien's voice was still level, still completely controlled. "But the initial prompt, the reason your name was on the list at all—" He stopped. "That was Carrera." Vivian sat back down. Not because she chose to exactly, more because her legs made the decision and she followed. She thought about this contract on the kitchen table. She thought about her lawyer saying it reads like someone who genuinely wants the arrangement to function. She thought about Lucian in the SUV saying you were the only person in that room who treated me like a human being, and the particular quality of honesty she'd heard in it, the ring of something genuinely felt rather than manufactured. She thought about this possibility that the arrangement had been manufactured before either of them had agreed to it. That the choice she'd believed she was making, the choice that had felt, despite everything, like a choice, had been architected by someone whose interest was in using her as a mechanism and who had correctly assessed that the mechanism would work better if neither of the principals understood they were inside it. "He wanted me here," she said, "as a liability, as the door Forsyth described." "Yes." "And you brought me here?" "Yes." Lucien's voice, for the first time, carried something that was not composure, something lower and more real. "I made a decision I believed was mine to make, and I made it with information I believed was clean, and it wasn't, and that is my responsibility." Vivian looked at the photographs on the desk. Marcus in a coffee shop. Marcus crossing the campus quad. Marcus sitting across from a man who looked entirely like a professional contact, and was in fact someone who had been specifically positioned to access her through the one angle her contract had attempted to make bulletproof. "He's been talking to Forsyth for 3 weeks," she said, approximately. "What has Forsyth been after?" "Information, primarily. The details of the contract structure, your movements, your schedule, your relationship to me as observed from Marcus's account of your conversations." A pause. "Marcus hasn't given him anything significant. He knows very little about the actual arrangement. He knows I work for a private client. He knows the payments come from offshore structures." She pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment. "He's not stupid, Lucien. He's been putting it together." "I know, which means he's at risk. Not because Forsyth is going to hurt him, not yet, not before they have what they want, but because the moment they decide Marcus is a fully developed asset rather than a recruitment in progress, the leverage calculus changes." "I know that too. So what are you going to do?" The question landed differently than the previous ones. Not accusatory, not even particularly emotional. The flat operational question of someone who has processed the dimensions of a problem and is now focused on the solution. Lucien looked at her. "Forsyth will be handled," he said. "Carrera is already being addressed. The Callahan angle requires more careful management because acting against them directly creates a conflict I'm not prepared to escalate." His eyes were very steady. "Marcus needs to be removed from Forsyth's access immediately. That can be done quietly. The relationship ended for any number of professional reasons, but it requires Marcus to cooperate without fully understanding why. I'll talk to him. He'll ask questions. I'll manage the questions." She stood up again, and this time it was deliberate, and she stayed standing. "And then you and I are going to have a different conversation." "About what?" "About the 11 days. She met his eyes. "About the fact that you made a decision to manage my information rather than give it to me. About whether that is something you're capable of not doing, whether the way you operate is fundamentally incompatible with the way I need to be treated in order to stay in this building." She paused. "We're going to have that conversation honestly, not as contractor and contracted party, as people." Lucien held her gaze. Something in his face moved, beneath the control, beneath the composed authority of a man who had spent 2 years rebuilding himself into something the underworld couldn't destabilize. Something shifted that she had no word for except opened. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. "Yeah." The conversation with Marcus took 40 minutes and happened on the phone while Vivian stood on the penthouse roof terrace with the city spread around her in its daytime configuration. Wind off the lake pressing her hair back from her face and carrying the late March cold that Chicago deployed well into spring with cheerful, consistent hostility. Marcus listened. He asked questions. She answered the question she could answer and said, "I can't explain that fully right now," for the ones she couldn't. And he pushed on 2 of them with the focused persistence of an engineer identifying a structural gap. And she held the line, and eventually he went quiet. "This guy Forsyth," he said, "is not what he presented himself as. And you've known that for, I found out this morning, Marcus. But someone connected to your situation has known for 11 days. "Yes." A very long pause. "Are you okay?" he said. "I'm working on it." "That's not the same as yes." "No," she agreed. "It's not. Viv." His voice shifted into the register she associated with the kitchen table conversations. The late nights after their mother died, when they had both been more honest with each other than perhaps they'd intended because exhaustion and grief had removed the usual editing function. "Are you in over your head?" She thought about it. Really thought about it. Standing on the roof with the wind in her face and the city 42 floors below making its indifferent, enormous noise. "I might be," she said, "but I don't think I'm in it alone." Another pause. "Okay," Marcus said finally, the same word he always used when he decided to trust her past the point where the evidence fully supported trust. "Okay, I'll tell Forsyth the conversation isn't going anywhere. Make it professional, low friction." "I know how to end a conversation, Viv." She almost smiled. "Yeah, you do." She hung up. She stood on the roof for another few minutes. She was thinking about Elise Marchetti saying he's different now. Ask him what it is. She was thinking about Sal's voice through the study door saying the way you talked about Friday's function was not the way a man talks about a business arrangement. She was thinking about the legal pad and the 4 words written and crossed out and rewritten. What happens after this? She was thinking about the thing that had been building in this penthouse for 6 weeks that neither of them had named because naming it meant deciding what to do with it. And deciding what to do with it meant acknowledging that the contract, the clean, specific, legally enforceable document that had made all of this feel manageable, was no longer an adequate description of the situation. She went back inside. Lucien was where she had left him, which she expected, but he had moved from behind the desk to the window position. His thinking position, she had learned, the place he went when he was working through something that required the city below to think against. She sat in the chair near the window. "Tell me about Carrera," she said. "Everything, from the beginning," he told her. It took 40 minutes, and it was thorough, and it was honest in a way that she could identify now. The particular quality of his honesty, which wasn't soft and wasn't apologetic, but was simply complete. Information delivered without the self-protective redactions that most people applied to things that made them look bad. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He built this," she said, "the entire structure. He knew your history with the ER. He knew my financial situation. He brought us both to the table and then stepped back and let us believe we'd arrived there independently." Yes. That means the contract itself, the terms, the structure. The contract is legitimate. My intention in the arrangement was genuine. Carrera's manipulation was in the origination, not the execution. He paused. That doesn't make it less of a violation. No. She looked at him. It doesn't. But it also doesn't change. He stopped. Doesn't change what? He looked at her for a long moment. What it became, he said, regardless of how it started. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up enough to make itself audible through the triple-pane glass. Vivian thought about the moment in the SUV when she'd understood she'd already made her decision. She thought about the bus stop and the cold and the math that didn't work. She thought about a man in a wheelchair who had looked at her from a sidewalk with the total patience of someone who had decided the universe would accommodate his timing, and how she had understood from that first moment that something about this was going to cost her more than the contract specified. "I need 24 hours, she said. "For what?" "To figure out what I'm doing." She stood up. "Not about the contract. About this. About what you just said about what it became." She looked at him directly. "I need time to think without the building around me." He nodded once. "Where will you go?" "The hospital, probably. I think better there." She picked up her bag. "Don't send anyone." "Vivian, Lucien." She looked at him. "If I'm going to trust you with the thing that's actually happening here, you have to trust me to walk out of this building alone and come back when I'm ready. Those have to be able to coexist." The silence lasted long enough to feel like a negotiation. "All right," he said. She left. She took the elevator down 42 floors and walked out into Chicago's March wind without a destination, just movement. Just the physical fact of the city around her and the completely disassembled state of every plan she'd made about what this year was supposed to be and mean and cost. She was 6 weeks into a 12-month contract. The contract had been engineered by someone who intended her as a weapon against the man she'd been contracted to support. The man she'd been contracted to support had, in 11 days of knowing this, protected her brother and managed information and done both of those things in ways that were simultaneously caring and controlling and completely, consistently, exhaustingly him. She was not in love with him. She told herself that with some firmness as she walked down Michigan Avenue with her coat inadequate against the lake wind. She was not in love with him. But she was also not uninvested, which was a different word for the same territory approached from a different angle. And she knew, walking through the city that had always been hers in the way cities are yours when they're the only home you've known, that the 24 hours she'd asked for weren't about figuring out whether to stay. She'd already made that decision standing on the roof with the phone in her hand. The 24 hours were about figuring out who she was going to be when she came back, because the woman who had walked out of this building 6 weeks ago and the woman walking through it now were not the same person. And the contract had never specified what happened to the person who changed in the middle of it. She was still working on the answer when her phone rang. The number on the screen was not one she recognized. She answered it. Ms. Hale. A voice she didn't know. Male, measured, carrying the specific flat courtesy of someone delivering a message they have been paid to deliver rather than a message they have formed themselves. I'm calling on behalf of Raymond Callahan. He'd like to meet. Tonight. Vivian stopped walking. Around her, Chicago moved in its afternoon configuration. Pedestrians, traffic, the indifferent, enormous machinery of a city that didn't pause for individual moments of reckoning. Why would I meet with Raymond Callahan? She said. Because, the voice said, he has something that belongs to you, and he's willing to return it in exchange for a conversation. A pause. What does he have? She said. Not what, Ms. Hale? A brief silence. Who? She kept her voice flat. Who? She said again. Your brother, Ms. Hale. The voice on the phone didn't shift register, didn't add warmth or edge, just delivered the information with the specific practiced neutrality of someone who had learned that affect was a liability in this kind of communication. He's safe. He'll remain safe. Mr. Callahan simply wants a conversation. Tonight, alone. The street around her continued its afternoon business. A cab leaned on its horn 2 blocks north. Someone's coffee cup hit a trash can lid and bounced. The city did not acknowledge that her world had just reduced itself to the dimensions of a single phone call. If he's touched, he hasn't been touched. Mr. Callahan is a businessman, not a... He understands the value of good faith in initial negotiations. This isn't a negotiation. Tonight at 9. The address will come by text. A pause. Come alone. If Mr. Moretti's people are in the vicinity, the conversation becomes more complicated for everyone involved. Another pause, briefer. Especially Marcus. The line went dead. Vivian stood on Michigan Avenue with the phone in her hand and the wind off the lake doing its indifferent worst and the particular cold clarity of someone whose thinking has been simplified by emergency descending over the noise of everything else she'd been carrying for the past 6 hours. She did not call Lucien. She stood there for 30 seconds and made the decision, and then she started walking. The address that came by text was a restaurant in River North, not a back room somewhere, not a warehouse, not any of the locations her imagination had immediately and unhelpfully generated. A restaurant. Cloth napkins, moderate lighting, the kind of place that did enough legitimate business that the presence of a booth in the back occupied by a man with security was unremarkable to anyone paying attention to their own evening. She had 4 hours. She spent the first one at the hospital, not working, just in the break room with a coffee she didn't drink, running through what she knew and what she didn't and what the variables were, applying the same triage logic she used on bad nights when there were too many patients and too few resources. And the only functional approach was honest assessment. What can be saved? What can't? What do you do first? Marcus was the priority. Whatever else was true, that was fixed. She thought about calling Lucien 3 more times and didn't, each time for a different reason. The first time because she needed to think without the weight of his reaction reorganizing her assessment. The second time because she was angry at him still, the specific unresolved anger of someone who has been protected in a way that felt identical to being managed. And she didn't want the anger making her decisions. The third time because she understood, with the particular clarity that came from quiet and a bad shift and too much coffee, that if she called him, he would not let her go alone, and that if she didn't go alone, Marcus would pay for it, and that this was a problem she had walked into through her own choices, and she was going to walk out of it the same way. She spent the second hour buying a dress from a boutique 2 blocks from the restaurant, something that read as appropriate for the venue, something that said she'd chosen to come rather than been summoned. She changed in the boutique's dressing room and left her coat and scrubs in a bag behind the counter and walked out into the evening in clothes that were not armor, but were the closest available approximation. She spent the third hour walking. Chicago in the early evening of a March Thursday had the particular quality of a city in transition, the workday unwinding, the night not yet fully assembled, the streets occupied by people in the middle of their passage from one version of the day to the next. She walked without destination through it and thought about her mother's hands and Marcus at the kitchen table and a man in a wheelchair at a bus stop and the specific irreversible nature of choices made under pressure. She thought about the fact that the contract she had signed described a transaction, and she had, inside the transaction, become someone it no longer fully described. She thought about what that meant and did not finish the thought because she was almost out of time. At 8:53, she walked into the restaurant. Raymond Callahan was 61 years old and looked like a man who had been large and physically formidable in his 40s and had retained the structure of that in his 60s in a way that read as solidity rather than decline. He had white hair, kept short, and the kind of face that might have been genial under other circumstances, and had instead developed over decades in rooms like this one into something more precisely readable as controlled, not warm, not cold, but calibrated. He stood when she approached. She did not extend her hand. "Ms. Hale." He indicated the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming. Where's my brother? Sit down. Where's Marcus?" Callahan looked at her for a moment, then tilted his head slightly at the man standing near the wall. Large, dark jacket, the particular quality of stillness that Vivian had come to recognize as belonging to men whose professional function was to be capable of violence and to communicate that capability through posture alone. The man took out a phone and made a call and handed it across the room to Vivian. Marcus's voice, "Viv, are you okay?" Yeah. I'm in an apartment somewhere. His voice was tight but functioning, the voice of someone who was scared and managing it. "I'm okay. There are 2 guys here, but nobody's hurt me." "Okay." She kept her voice level with the specific effort of someone who has made a professional practice of keeping her voice level when she was not. "I'm handling it. Don't do anything. Don't argue with them. Just wait." "Viv, I've got it, Marcus." She handed the phone back. She sat down. Callahan resumed his seat with the unhurried ease of a man in an environment he considered his. He poured water into the glass in front of her. She did not touch it. "I'll be direct," he said. "Please. Lucien Moretti is a problem, not personally, professionally, territorially, in the way that 2 organizations occupying adjacent spaces will always, eventually, create friction. The injury changed his operational capacity, not enough to remove him, but enough to create an opening." He folded his hands on the table with the deliberate, precise manner of someone arranging his argument before presenting it. "The marriage complicated things. It was a smart move. I underestimated how smart." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the marriage is also the solution." He looked at her steadily. "You're inside his operation, not officially, not functionally, but domestically, which is closer than any of my people have been able to get in 3 years. I'm not asking you to do anything dramatic. I'm asking for information. The structure of his current financial arrangements. Any active negotiations with the Marchetti or DeLuca organizations. The general state of his operational recovery." A pause. "Details that, in the normal course of living with someone, you would have access to without seeking." Vivian looked at him. "And if I say no?" "Then Marcus stays with my people until we reach a different arrangement." He said it without heat, without any of the performative menace she might have expected. Just information. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I want information. Those are compatible goals if you're willing. You're asking me to spy on my husband. I'm asking you to have a practical conversation about your situation." He tilted his head slightly. "Your situation being, you are in a contractual arrangement with a man who runs a criminal organization. You have a brother who is currently a guest of mine, and you have, by my assessment, approximately 6 more months before the contract ends, and you return to a hospital shift in a smaller apartment and the same financial pressures you had before." A pause. "Unless you make a decision now that changes those circumstances." "What decision?" "Help me. Information only. Nothing that puts you in physical risk. In exchange, Marcus leaves tonight. Your contract payments continue uninterrupted regardless of what happens to Moretti's organization in the next 6 months, and there's an additional payment at the end." He named a number. The number was large. Vivian looked at the tablecloth for a moment. The cloth was white. Very white. The kind of white that required maintenance to sustain. "You had Carrera plant me," she said. A brief pause. Something in Callahan's expression acknowledged this without confirming it, which was itself a confirmation. "Carrera identified an opportunity," he said. "I authorized him to pursue it. So this entire thing, the contract, the arrangement, my being in that building, was your design from the beginning. The introduction was arranged. What happened after was," he paused, "somewhat beyond the original plan, frankly." Meaning I expected the arrangement to remain transactional, I did not anticipate that Lucien would. He stopped, and something in his face shifted into an expression she couldn't read, except that it was more complex than anything he'd shown so far. He's different than he was. The injury changed him in ways I didn't account for. And you appear to have accelerated whatever that change is. A pause. Which makes this conversation both more necessary and more complicated. Vivian was quiet. She was thinking very fast underneath the stillness she was projecting, running calculations, assessing variables, applying the same triage logic she'd used in the break room, and arriving rapidly at the same conclusion from multiple directions. She thought about the phone call in the corridor, the Hale transfer, outside the main ledger. She thought about Lucien saying, "I don't know the protocol for what's in between." She thought about the legal pad and the 4 words he'd written, and the 11 days and the morning's information, and the conversation on the roof with the wind in her face. She thought about the moment she understood that she'd already made her decision and was just finding the words for it. "I need to use the bathroom," she said. Callahan looked at her. "Of course," he said, with the careful, watchful courtesy of someone who has granted a small concession and is monitoring closely for what it costs. She stood up. She walked toward the back of the restaurant with the unhurried step of someone who was not running and was not panicking and had in the past 4 hours made 2 decisions that she was now going to execute in sequence. In the bathroom, she stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror for approximately 4 seconds. Then she took out her phone and called Lucien. He answered before the first ring finished. "Where are you?" His voice was the voice she'd never heard before. Stripped of the control, stripped of the managed calm, carrying something raw and immediate underneath it, like a current under still water. "River North, Caravaggio's restaurant. I'm in the bathroom." She kept her voice low and level. "Marcus is being held somewhere. He's okay, not hurt. Callahan wants information about your operations. He has a secondary exit on the north side of the building. His man near the wall is armed, probably 2 others in the restaurant I haven't identified." A silence that lasted exactly as long as it took him to process and decide. "How long can you give me?" 10 minutes if I'm careful, less if he gets impatient." "Vivian." His voice. Just her name and everything in it. "Lucien." She met her own eyes in the mirror. "Get Marcus first. The building can wait." "I'm already moving." A pause. "Go back to the table. Do not agree to anything." "I know." She hung up. She ran cold water over her wrists. An old trick, slows the heart rate, quiets the hands, dried them, adjusted her dress, and walked back out to the table with the same unhurried step she'd left with. Callahan watched her sit down with the expression of a man taking a reading. "Shall we continue?" he said. "Tell me more about the additional payment," she said. And she bought Lucien Moretti 9 minutes and 40 seconds. The first sign was the man near the wall. He received a message on his phone. Vivian saw his eyes go to the screen in the peripheral way of someone trying to check something without appearing to check it, and the quality of his stillness changed. She knew that change. She'd seen it in the ER when a situation shifted category, when something that had been managed became something that needed immediate attention. He leaned toward Callahan and said something too low for her to hear. Callahan's face did not move, but his hands, which had been folded precisely on the table, unfolded. "It seems," he said, his voice perfectly even, "that we've had an interruption." "I don't know what you mean," Vivian said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You called him." "I used the bathroom. Ms. Hale." His voice shifted, not threatening, which would have been easier to read, but something more precise. Disappointed. The specific disappointment of someone whose assessment of a variable has turned out to be incorrect. "I underestimated you too." "You underestimated both of us," she said. The restaurant had changed configuration in the past 90 seconds in ways the other diners hadn't processed yet. The man near the wall had been joined by a second man from somewhere Vivian hadn't tracked, and both of them had the alert, focused quality of people who had received information that had upgraded the situation. Near the front entrance, something was happening that Vivian could see in the way the host stand had gone quiet, and the young woman behind it had taken 2 steps back. Callahan was still looking at her. "This doesn't end well," he said, "for anyone in this room." "Let Marcus go," she said. "Right now. That's the only thing I care about." You're not in a position. Let him go. Vivian. Lucian's voice from somewhere behind her. She turned. He had come through the service entrance. She understood this from the direction, from the fact that he was flanked by two men she recognized from the penthouse rather than the front, and from the particular contained momentum of people who had moved quickly and recently through a space not designed for them. He was in the wheelchair, which should have made the entrance less than it was, and did not, in the way that the space around him had never seemed to notice the wheelchair's presence as a limitation, but only as a fact, a fixed coordinate around which everything else arranged itself. He looked at her first. The fraction of a second before he looked at Callahan, he looked at her, checked her, assessed her, ran whatever internal calculation he ran when he needed to know if someone he cared about was intact. And she saw it happen and felt it register in a place below the adrenaline and the cold clarity of the past 4 hours, felt it the way you feel something that is true before you finished arguing with yourself about whether to believe it. Then he looked at Callahan. Raymond, he said, Lucien. Callahan had the quality of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was processing the specifics of that without allowing the processing to become visible as distress. I see you've recovered some of your operational speed. Where is her brother? Being escorted to the street as we speak. A pause. I'm a man of my word on the basics. The basics, Lucian repeated. Flat. You built a surveillance architecture inside my life using my attorney and my contract, and a woman who had nothing to do with any of this, and you want credit for the basics. I want the same thing I've always wanted, which is a clear territorial boundary and a conversation about the Southside operations that doesn't require us to be pointing things at each other. Callahan's voice carried the particular weathered patience of a man who has been having versions of the same argument for 30 years and has gotten philosophical about the repetition. The method was aggressive. I'll concede that. You used her as a mechanism. I used an available resource. You've done the same. The words landed in the room, and Vivian watched Lucian absorb them, and watched his jaw go tight, and watched him not answer for 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than he needed to formulate a response, and which meant the response he'd formulated and discarded had been a different one from the response he then chose. Ms. Hale is not a resource, he said. She is my wife. The 3 words, delivered in the same flat, controlled register he used for financial structures and tactical assessments and every other category of operational fact, carrying within them, because of the register rather than despite it, the precise weight of something irrevocable. Callahan looked at him. Then he looked at Vivian. Something in his expression shifted into what she might, in another situation, have called respect. That's new, he said. Tell your men to stand down, Lucian said. We're leaving, all 3 of us. And the conversation will happen. Not tonight, not like this. A pause. You want a legitimate discussion about territory? I'll give you one. After tonight, you have forfeited the right to conduct it through her. Callahan was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once at the man near the wall. The restaurant exhaled. What's? Marcus was outside on the sidewalk when they came through the front entrance, standing between 2 men in dark jackets who released him immediately when they saw Vivian, and he crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and she met him halfway, and he was taller than her now, had been for 5 years, and he held on with the specific, wordless intensity of someone who has had several hours to contemplate a worse case and is relieved to be in the best case instead. I'm okay, she said, into his shoulder. I know, he said. You said. He pulled back enough to look at her face. You okay? Yeah. He looked past her to where Lucian had come through the entrance and was positioned on the sidewalk with the particular quality of alert stillness that Vivian had come to recognize as his version of standing guard, the specific attention of someone whose mobility was different, but whose capacity to make a space feel held was entirely intact. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. You're him, Marcus said. Yes, Lucian said. You sent people to watch me for 11 days without telling my sister. A pause. Yes, Lucian said again. No deflection, no qualification, just the word. Marcus looked at him for another moment with the focused architectural assessment of a young engineer identifying load-bearing elements. She's the most important person in my life, Marcus said, in case that's not already clear to you. It is, Lucien said. Clearly. Marcus looked at Vivian. She looked back. I'm staying tonight, she told him. At the penthouse. We'll talk tomorrow properly, and I'll answer what I can. I have questions. I know you do. A lot of them. Marcus. Fine. He looked between them once more, his engineer's brain visibly working the structural problem of what he was looking at, what relationship was being presented to him in the geometry of these two people on a sidewalk. Fine. Text me when you're up tomorrow. He left. She watched him go until the corner took him, and then she let out one long breath that she'd been holding for approximately 4 hours. Lucien was beside her. You called me, he said. Yes. After I kept the information from you for 11 days, after everything this morning. He was looking at her profile. You still called me. She turned to look at him. He looked not tired exactly, because tired wasn't quite the right word for a man who had been running on controlled adrenaline through a sequence of events that had included the complete structural collapse of his internal security and a restaurant confrontation and whatever it had cost him in the hours between her leaving the penthouse and this sidewalk to hold the operational pieces together, while also, she understood this now, reading him in the way she'd learned to, maintaining the specific, unrelenting focus on her location and her safety that had been, she realized, the actual center of gravity of his afternoon. You didn't tell him anything, Lucien said. It was not quite a question. No. Why not? She held his gaze. Because the information was yours, she said, and because betraying you would have required me to be a different person than I am. And I've been this person for 31 years, and I'm not changing it for Raymond Callahan. He looked at her for a long moment. Wow. The city moved around them. A cab. Someone walking a dog. The particular sound of Chicago on a Thursday night assembling itself into its nocturnal configuration, the shift change of the world, the restaurants filling, the other version of the city coming on. Come home, Lucien said. And the word home, in his voice, on this sidewalk, after this night, arrived with the full weight of everything it had become and everything it had been pretending not to be, and Vivian Hale, who had been a nurse in an emergency room and a sister and a person who kept her own accounts and owed nothing to anyone she hadn't chosen, felt the last distance between who she was in the contract and who she had become close in a way she understood was not reversible. There's still something we haven't finished, she said. I know. The conversation. What you said about what this became. I know. Tonight, she said. We finish it tonight. He looked up at her with the gray eyes she had learned to read the way you learn to read a city, the street-level detail that was different from the aerial view, the personal geography of a place that revealed itself only through the sustained attention of someone who had decided to stay. Yes, he said. She walked beside him through the city that had always been hers, the city she'd grown up in and worked in and survived in and never seen from 42 floors up until a night 3 months ago when everything changed, and felt, underneath the adrenaline and the exhaustion and the complex, unresolved architecture of everything that still needed to be said, the simple, unargued fact of what she was walking toward. The SUV was at the curb. She got in, and as the city scrolled past the tinted windows in its night configuration, the grid of streets and the dark suggestion of the lake and the clustered lights of the neighborhood spreading south and west and north, Vivian looked at the man across from her and thought about contracts and what they described and what they failed to describe in the specific, irreversible nature of the moment when the description stops being adequate. He was looking at the window. She could see in the reflection of the glass that he was also looking at her. Neither of them spoke. The building was 20 blocks away. 20 blocks to figure out how to say the thing that had been building for 3 months in a penthouse above a city that belonged to monsters and criminals and people who used other people as mechanisms and which had nevertheless managed, in the space between a contract and its 12-month expiration, to become the place where one of those monsters had discovered, against his own considerable resistance, that the armor he'd built around the wreckage of himself had a door, and that he had, with the specific irreversible nature of things done without fully authorizing them, left it open. The building came into view, 42 floors of dark stone and glass that caught the city's light without returning it. Vivian looked at it. Then she looked at Lucien, who was already looking at her, who had stopped pretending to look at the window at some point in the last 20 blocks, and whose expression carried, Beneath the control, beneath the architecture of the composed and capable man he'd rebuilt himself into. Something that was simply, undefended, and entirely clearly. "Please don't leave!" The SUV pulled to the curb. The door opened, and Vivian Hale, who had signed a contract 3 months ago in a stone building 42 floors above Chicago and told herself it was a transaction with a fixed end date and a clear exit, stepped out into the cold March night and walked toward the entrance of the building that had become, without her full authorization and without any language in the original document to account for it, the elevator ride took 40 seconds. Neither of them spoke. Vivian watched the floor numbers climb on the small display above the door and listened to the sound of her own breathing and the low, mechanical hum of the elevator moving upward through the building, and thought about the word home and the way he'd said it on the sidewalk with the particular unguarded directness of a man who had run out of the energy required to say anything else. The doors opened into the penthouse. She walked in first. The space was dark except for the ambient light of the city coming through the windows. Chicago at 10:30 on a Thursday, laying its grid of orange and white across the floor in the long, flat geometry of urban light through glass. Nobody had left lamps on. The house staff had gone. The security personnel were somewhere in the building, but not in this space, which had the quality of a room that had been waiting. She kept her coat on and walked to the window and stood there for a moment with the city below her and the room behind her, and the sound of Lucien navigating the wheelchair through the entrance and across the floor toward her, the soft, specific sound of it that she had learned in 3 months, the way you learn the sounds of any place you've inhabited long enough for them to stop being noise and start being texture. He stopped beside her. They stood, she standing, he seated, the differential in height, meaning she was looking slightly down and he was looking slightly up at the same city, which somehow felt correct, which somehow felt like the honest version of the geometry between them, and looked at Chicago for a long moment without speaking. "Carrera," she said finally. "I want to know the end of it. What happened to him? He's been removed from any connection to my organization, financially, professionally, personally." Lucien's voice was level. He understood the terms. "Is he alive?" A pause. "Yes," Lucien said. "He's alive. That was a decision I made, not because I was merciful, but because the cost of the alternative wasn't worth what it would have taken from me." A beat. "That's a different calculation than I would have made 3 years ago." Vivian turned that over. "Callahan," she said. "The meeting he wants will happen next week. Sal is handling the preliminary terms. The Southside question has a workable answer. It always had a workable answer. The problem was that neither side had anyone at the table who was interested in working rather than positioning." He paused. "That's been addressed." "Forsyth, gone. Not dead. Gone from anything adjacent to this organization, this family, this city, if he's intelligent, which he apparently is because he was on a plane to Phoenix by 8 this morning." A slight pause on the word family that she registered and didn't comment on. "The Marcus connection has been fully severed. His academic records show no irregularities. His financial situation, his tuition, his housing, is clean and documented through legitimate scholarship structures that Sal established this morning. No offshore routing, no connection to Moretti Holdings. It will hold scrutiny from any direction." She looked at him. "You did that this morning." "I did that while you were walking on Michigan Avenue, and I was working from the penthouse with 11 phones and considerably elevated stress levels, yes." Something in her chest moved. Not dramatically, just a quiet interior shift, the kind that happened when a thing you'd been holding against someone resolves itself into evidence of a different truth. "You were angry with me," he said. "This morning, rightfully." "I was. And you still called me from the bathroom of that restaurant." "I told you why." "You said the information was mine, and betraying me would have required you to be a different person." He was looking at her profile. "That's not a small thing to say." "No," she agreed. "It's not." The city went about its business 42 floors below. A siren somewhere, brief and then gone. The suggestion of music from somewhere, a bar, an open window, the collective sound of the city's nightlife in aggregate, indistinguishable and continuous. "I need to say something," Lucien said. She waited. "Carrera brought your name to me. That's true. The origination of the arrangement was manipulated." He paused, and she could hear in the pause the specific effort of a man who was not practiced at this particular kind of speech, and was refusing to let the unfamiliarity be an excuse to say it imprecisely. But I reviewed the list myself. I made the decision myself. I chose you because of what I remembered from that night in March, and the investigation confirmed what I'd already decided, and the decision was genuinely mine even if the context around it was compromised. Another pause. I want you to know that I would have chosen you regardless, that the manipulation didn't create my judgment. It just put your name in front of it. Vivian looked at him. I know, she said quietly. How? Because I know what it sounds like when you're being honest and what it sounds like when you're managing something. You've been honest about this since the moment Sal told you. She held his gaze. That's how I know. He was quiet. The contract, she said. What about it? It ends in 6 months. Yes. What do you want to happen in 6 months? The question sat in the room. Outside, a cloud moved across whatever portion of the sky was visible between the buildings, and the ambient light shifted fractionally, and the room breathed. I want you to stay, he said, simply, completely. Without the scaffolding of qualification or context or contractual language to give it the appearance of something other than what it was. Not on contract, not as an arrangement. I want you to stay because you choose to. Vivian looked at him for a long time. She thought about the bus stop and the cold and the math that didn't work. She thought about her mother's hands and Marcus saying, I trust you with the simplicity of something that had never required re-examination. She thought about 36 hours on her feet and the particular bone-deep exhaustion of a person who had been holding everything together for so long that the prospect of putting some of it down felt as frightening as it felt necessary. She thought about 3 months in a penthouse with a man who had been broken in a specific way and had rebuilt himself into something harder and more capable, and underneath the hardness and the capability, more careful than before, more aware of what things cost, more willing to sit with that awareness rather than root around it. She thought about the ways she loved Marcus, which were the ways you loved someone whose survival had been your responsibility, and who had become, over years of shared difficulty, not just someone you protected, but someone who made you better at being yourself by existing. She thought about the way she had started, somewhere around week 4, to think about Lucien Moretti in some of those same terms, and how she had talked herself out of acknowledging it approximately a dozen times, and how those 12 conversations with herself had been among the least convincing she'd ever had. I need something from you first, she said. Name it. The 11 days. She met his eyes. Not the operational decision. I understand the operational logic, and I'm not asking you to apologize for protecting Marcus. I'm asking about the decision to protect me from the information, the decision that I couldn't handle knowing and operating simultaneously. She paused. That's the thing that I need to not happen again. Not because I'm fragile, because I'm not, and you know I'm not. And the choice to manage my information rather than trust me with it is a choice that says something about how you see me that I can't live with if it's the permanent version. He held her gaze through the whole of it. You're right, he said. I know I'm right. I'm asking if you can change it. I'm telling you I will. He said it with the flat, specific certainty of a man making an operational commitment. Not because it's easy, because it's necessary. Because the version of this where I manage you is not the version I want. A pause. And because you demonstrated tonight, in a restaurant bathroom with Callahan's man 12 feet away, that you are better at this than I gave you credit for, and I don't intend to make that mistake again. Vivian looked at him for a moment longer. Then she did something she hadn't planned, which seemed to be a pattern with him. She reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on the wheel of the wheelchair, and felt his hand turn under hers and hold on with the immediate, unhesitating grip of someone who had been waiting for the chance and wasn't going to miss it now that it arrived. They stayed like that for a while. The city did what it did. Sam. She called Marcus at 9 the next morning. He came to the penthouse at 11, which Vivian understood as a statement. The 47-minute transit time from the UIC campus meant he'd left at 10:13, which meant he'd been ready to leave before she called, which meant he'd spent the morning preparing for this conversation with the focused architectural thoroughness that he brought to every problem he considered important. She met him in the lobby and they rode up together, and she used the 40 seconds of elevator time to say, "He's not a perfect person. The situation is not a simple one. I'm asking you to reserve judgment until you've spent time with him." "I reserved judgment for 30 seconds last night on the sidewalk," Marcus said. "Then he admitted to the surveillance without trying to spin it, and I upgraded him from unknown threat to complicated. That's about as fast as I go." "That's fair." "Is it serious?" She looked at the floor numbers. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "Processing." "Okay," he said. The doors opened. The meeting between Marcus and Lucian lasted 3 hours. Vivian was present for portions of it and absent for others, making coffee she didn't need and answering emails she'd been postponing, and standing at the kitchen window watching the city in its late morning configuration while, in the living room, two people who were both important to her conducted the specific, unscripted negotiation of men assessing each other without the vocabulary or the established terms for what they were to each other. She heard fragments. Lucien explaining the structure of the legitimate holdings, the real ones, the ones that had been built over years of directing money through clean channels for reasons that had started as financial pragmatism and had shifted, gradually and with increasing intentionality, toward something that had begun to resemble genuine purpose. Marcus asking questions with the precise, structural focus of someone identifying load-bearing elements and testing them for tolerance. The occasional silence that meant neither of them was filling space with noise and both of them were thinking, which Vivian recognized as the specific, functional silence of two people who were more similar than their circumstances suggested. At one point she heard Marcus say, "She's carried everything since she was 14, just so you know." "I know she doesn't say that, but that's what it was." And Lucien, after a pause, "I know. She's not going to tell you when it's too much. She'll just keep going until she can't." "I know that too." "Then you know your job." A pause. "Yes," Lucien said. "I do." Vivian stood in the kitchen and did not cry, which required a specific active effort that she applied without ceremony, and then went back to the emails. Marcus left at 2. At the door, he hugged her in the way he hugged her when something had been confirmed rather than merely hoped, fully, briefly, with the specific quality of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it. "I like him," he said quietly, into her shoulder. "Don't tell him that yet," she said. "He'll get insufferable." Marcus laughed, real, surprised, and she felt him relax completely, all the morning's careful assessment releasing at once into something lighter. "Text me tonight," he said. "Go to class," she said. He went. That evening, Vivian did something she hadn't done since she moved into the penthouse. She cooked, not because it was necessary. The house staff kept the kitchen functional, and there was always food available in the way that things were always available in a household that ran on the kind of money that solved logistical problems by definition. She cooked because she wanted to, because it was something her hands knew how to do without instruction, because the kitchen was the room in the penthouse that had no operational weight, and she needed, after 3 days that had contained more concentrated consequence than most months, something that was just the physical fact of doing a simple thing. She found pasta and tomatoes and the particular configuration of pantry staples that suggested the house staff maintained a kitchen for function rather than cuisine, and she made something basic and imprecise and entirely without the intention of impressing anyone. Lucien appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during this process. He watched her for a moment without speaking, in the way he watched things, with the total unhurried attention that she had initially found unsettling and had come to understand as simply the way he was present with things he cared about. "Sit down," she said. "Don't offer to help." "I wasn't going to offer to help." "You were considering it." "I was considering commenting on the technique." She turned around and looked at him. He met her eyes with the specific, controlled expression of a man not smiling with his mouth. "Don't," she said. "No," he agreed. He stayed in the kitchen. She cooked. He poured wine and set the table, the small table near the window that looked out at the evening city, which was different from the formal dining space at the other end of the penthouse. Smaller and less architectural and more, she had always thought, like a table that belonged to people rather than a room that performed the concept of dining. They ate. The conversation was ordinary in a way that felt extraordinary in its ordinariness. Marcus's engineering program, a paper he'd mentioned wanting to read, the hospital, and a case she'd been thinking about. The charity infrastructure Lucien had described wanting to expand. The specific logistical texture of two people whose lives had become genuinely shared rather than contractually proximate. At some point, she noticed that the contract, the physical document, the one she had signed in this building and which had defined the legal architecture of the past 3 months, was no longer visible on the desk or the table or anywhere in the penthouse that she could see. "The contract," she said. He looked at her. "Where is it?" "Sal has it. The original is with the legal team." A pause. "There's a dissolution document ready whenever we want to formalize the change of terms." "Formalize the change of terms," she repeated. "That's the language you're using for this. Would you prefer different language?" "I prefer clarity," she said. He looked at her across the small table with the city evening behind him and the wine glass in his hand and the expression of a man who was going to say the thing completely or not at all, which she had come to understand was the only mode available to him for things that actually mattered. "I want to marry you," he said, "not on a contract, not for an organization or a strategic arrangement or any reason that belongs to that world." He paused. "For the reason that you are the most genuinely present person I have ever met, and that being known by you is the most clarifying experience of my adult life, and that I have no interest in the version of the future that doesn't have you in it." He set the wine glass down. "That's the language I'd prefer." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 31 years of managing the math, of carrying what needed to be carried, of being the person who stayed functional when the alternative was falling apart. She thought about what it felt like to be in a room with someone who paid total, unhurried attention to the things they cared about, and to have become one of those things. She thought about the fact that the world he inhabited was not clean and would not become clean, that the work Sal was doing to build the charity infrastructure and the legitimate holdings was real and ongoing and built on a foundation that was not. And she was honest about this, with herself, because she was always honest with herself. Entirely clean. She thought about whether she could live with that knowledge, hold it alongside the other knowledge, the knowledge of who he was in the kitchen doorway watching her cook, in the study at 4 a.m, writing what happens after this on a legal pad, on the sidewalk outside a restaurant saying the word home with everything he meant by it. She decided she could. She had made her decision. She picked up her wine glass. "Ask me properly," she said, "not as a business proposal." Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise, but the specific fractional disruption of a man whose composure has been moved by something he hadn't fully prepared for. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do in 3 months. Not fully, not like this. He smiled. Not the controlled, minimal expression she'd cataloged over weeks of close attention. A real one, with the particular quality of something that had gotten past the management and arrived on his face without being approved first. "Vivian," he said. "Lucien," she said. "Stay," he said. "Please, as my wife, as a person who chose this and keeps choosing it. As someone I will, to the best of my actual capability, tell the truth to even when the truth is difficult, and I'm tempted to manage it instead." He paused. "I'm asking you." She looked at him. She put the wine glass down. "Yes," she said. 6 months later, a charity gala filled the ballroom of a hotel in the Gold Coast. The Moretti Foundation, not Moretti Holdings, not a corporate structure with a clean exterior and a complex interior, but a foundation, legitimate and publicly registered, with a board of directors that included 3 people Lucien had specifically recruited for their inability to be influenced by him. Hosted its inaugural fundraising event for 2 initiatives, spinal injury rehabilitation centers and emergency healthcare access for underserved Southside neighborhoods. The initiatives had been Vivian's idea. The funding structure, the legal architecture, the specific allocation of what Lucien privately called the empire's dirty money toward the creation of something clean that had been a 6-month project conducted in evenings at the kitchen table and weekends on the rooftop and long detailed arguments about what was possible versus what was merely optimistic, which were the best arguments Vivian had ever had because they were the first arguments in her life where the other person was as rigorous as she was and as unwilling to settle for imprecision. The ballroom held 200 people. Vivian stood near the back in a deep blue dress, the same color she'd worn for the first arrangement, which was intentional in a private way that didn't require explanation, and watched Lucien navigate the room with the ease of a man who had reconfigured his relationship to his own presence. No longer the stillness of someone managing perception, but the stillness of someone who was simply, genuinely, at home in a room and had nothing to prove to it. He delivered a speech. She had read the draft the night before and told him to remove the third paragraph because it was the kind of writing that happened when a person was explaining their intentions rather than demonstrating them. And he had looked at her with the expression he reserved for correct criticism that he found personally inconvenient, and he had removed it. The version he delivered was better. She watched people's faces while he spoke. Politicians, businessmen, the representatives of the 5 families attending under the mutual understanding that the Moretti Foundation's public legitimacy created a pressure toward restraint that served everyone's interests. She watched their faces, and she watched the room calculate what it was looking at, revise its assumptions, come to the slow, visible conclusion that the man in the wheelchair was neither the diminished figure the injury had been supposed to produce, nor the unchanged mafia king who had simply weathered the attempt. He was something else, something the room didn't fully have language for yet. She watched a woman in the 3rd row, the wife of a city alderman, someone with no connection to anything criminal, simply a public figure at a charity event, listen to Lucienne speak and lean toward her husband and say something, and the alderman nod, and both of them look at Lucien with the specific expression of people who have been surprised into genuine engagement. She thought, there it is. That's what it looks like. Sal materialized beside her. This had become, over 6 months, something approaching a functional relationship. Not warm, not easy, but functional in the way of 2 people who had both decided that the person between them was worth the accommodation required. The Callahan agreement holds, he said quietly, without preamble, because Sal did not do preamble. The south side boundary has been stable for 4 months. The preliminary assessment on the DeLuca conversation is positive. That's good. It is. A pause. The Foundation Board meets Thursday. The Spinal Rehab Center in Pilsen breaks ground next month. Another pause. The alderman in the 3rd row has been talking about the new emergency care initiative for 20 minutes. Vivian glanced at him. You've been tracking his conversation? I track conversations. It's what I do. A beat. He's going to call the office Monday morning about a partnership. She looked at the alderman, who was still leaning forward in his seat with the engaged focus of someone whose interest had become genuinely operational. Good, she said. Sal was quiet for a moment. You're good for him, he said. It came out the way things came out when Sal said them. Flat, direct, stripped of any of the softening that would have made it easier to receive, which paradoxically made it more credible. I want you to know that I was wrong. About the risk. About what I said in the study that night. Vivian looked at him. You weren't entirely wrong, she said. The risk was real. The risk was real, he agreed. But the calculation was wrong. I was weighting his vulnerability and discounting his judgment. A pause. His judgment was better than mine on this particular question. She held his gaze. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He drifted away into the room the way Sal drifted, efficiently, without announcement, one moment present, and the next present somewhere else. Yet, Lucien found her afterward, when the room was thinning and the staff was beginning the quiet work of disassembling the event. He came alongside her and they stood near the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, looking out at the city in its late-night iteration. The same city, the same grid of light, the same dark suggestion of the lake against the eastern skyline. The same Chicago she had lived in for 31 years and known from street level and bus windows and the particular angle of a hospital corridor window, and now, for the better part of a year, from 42 floors up. The alderman wants to call Monday, she said. I know, Sal told me. The speech was good. You told me to cut the 3rd paragraph. The speech without the 3rd paragraph was good. He looked at the city. How are you? He said. The specific question. Not how was tonight, not how did it go, but how are you, directed at her and not the event. The way he asked it when he wanted the real answer. She thought about it honestly. She was tired in the way that came from 6 months of sustained, significant effort, not the grinding survival-level exhaustion of the years before this, but the cleaner tiredness of someone who has been spending energy on things that mattered and had the specific, settled feeling of that expenditure being worthwhile. She was clear in a way she hadn't been in a long time, or possibly ever. She was, underneath the tiredness and the clarity and the complicated ongoing work of building a life inside a world that required her to hold multiple truths simultaneously. She was good. She was genuinely, unreservedly good. "I'm good," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah?" Not disbelieving, just wanting the full version. "Yeah." She turned to face him. "I'm good, Lucien." He held her gaze for a moment and then did the thing she had never gotten entirely used to and suspected she wasn't meant to, the thing that happened when he was not managing his expression. He looked at her with the total, unhurried attention of someone for whom the looking was itself the thing, the end rather than the means, the way you look at something you are still, every time, slightly surprised to have. She put her hand against his face. He turned into it, slightly. A small movement. The specific movement of someone who has learned, slowly and against the grain of years of not doing so, to receive a thing without converting it immediately into something functional. "Ready to go home," she said. "Yes," he said. They left together through the side entrance, past the security detail that arranged itself with the quiet efficiency she had long since stopped registering as remarkable, into the cold March air that Chicago deployed with the same consistent hostility in March of this year as it had in February of the year before, as if the lake had opinions about seasonal transitions and chose to share them at length. The SUV was at the curb. She got in first. He was beside her, and the door closed, and the city began its scroll past the tinted windows. The familiar grid, the dark places between the lights, the neighborhoods going south and west and north, with their 10,000 interior lives proceeding at full volume in the spaces between the buildings. Vivian watched it go by. She thought about a bus stop and a February night and a woman standing in the cold doing math that didn't work, and a row of black SUVs arriving in silence from the direction of something she didn't yet understand. She thought about all the things she'd told herself that night and in the months that followed, the clean, specific lies that had been necessary at the time and which had dissolved one by one in the face of the evidence that accumulated in a penthouse 42 floors above the city that had always been hers. She thought about the fact that the best decisions of her life had felt, at the moment of making them, like managed risk, like the deliberate, clear-eyed choice to enter a situation with incomplete information because the alternative, staying out, staying safe, staying in the apartment with the broken car, and the math that didn't work, was no longer a version of living she was willing to call sufficient. She thought about her mother, who had processed the unfairness and moved past the processing into the doing, and who had said, "You don't have enough time for both." She had made her time count. Lucien's hand found hers in the dark interior of the SUV. She held on. Outside, the city that belonged to monsters and criminals, and people who used other people as mechanisms, went about its midnight business, indifferent and vast and entirely unconcerned with the private revolution that had taken place in one of its towers over the course of 12 months, the small, unwitnessed transformation of a man who had survived an attempt on his life, and a woman who had survived the slower, quieter kind of attrition, both of them arriving through a contract and a bus stop, and a bathroom phone call and a kitchen table, and 6 months of building something clean out of complicated materials, at the same place, in the same moment, choosing the same thing. The building came into view, the dark stone that caught the city's light without returning it. Vivian looked at it, and then she didn't look at it anymore. She looked at Lucienne, who was looking at her with the eyes she had learned to read the way you learn to read a city, and she thought, this is what it looks like when something is real, not perfect, not clean, not simple or easy, or without the ongoing work of two people who were both, in their different ways, better at surviving than at staying, learning to stay. Just real. The SUV pulled to the curb, 42 floors above Chicago, in a penthouse that had once been ruled by silence and solitude and the particular chosen darkness of a man who had rebuilt himself around absence rather than presence. A light was on in the kitchen. Vivian looked at it. Lucienne followed her gaze upward to the single-lit window in the dark face of the building, the small, ordinary, completely unextraordinary fact of a light left on in a room where someone intended to return. "Marcus came by earlier," Lucy said. "He must have left it on." She looked at the light for a moment longer. "Good," she said, and meant it, meant the light. meant Marcus, meant the kitchen that was just a kitchen, meant the 42 floors and the city below them and the complicated, ongoing, entirely worthwhile project of a life shared between two people who had found each other at a bus stop on a February night when the math didn't work and decided, separately and then together, that the math could be rewritten. She got out of the car. The cold hit her face the way it always did. Direct, opinionated, entirely characteristic. She walked toward the entrance. Behind her, she heard Lucien say something to the driver, heard the specific sound of the wheelchair on the pavement, felt without turning around. The particular quality of attention that moved with him everywhere he went. And that she had learned, over a year of sleeping 40 feet away from it, and working beside it, and arguing against it, and eventually, fully, choosing it, she felt it settle against her back like a hand. She held the door. He came through. They went up together, and the light in the kitchen was on, and the city was below them doing what the city did, and the space that had once been cold with the specific coldness of a life organized around survival rather than living was warm in the particular way that spaces become warm when they are no longer empty in the ways that matter. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in the clearest possible language. By staying, by choosing, by the ongoing, daily, undramatic act of two people deciding that the version of themselves they were becoming was worth the cost of the becoming. The elevator opened. They went home.